The last trail. The morning mist clung to the pine needles like ghostly fingers as Scoutmaster Bryan Adams checked his compass one final time. Glacier National Park stretched endlessly before them, a pristine wilderness that had remained unchanged for millennia. He had led dozens of expeditions into these mountains over his 23 years with Troop 447. But something felt different about this trip. The air carried a weight he couldn't quite identify, and the usual chorus of birdsong seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "Mr. Adams, how much further to the campsite?" called out Tommy Martinez, a gangly 14-year-old whose enthusiasm for the outdoors had earned him the nickname Compass among his fellow scouts. Despite his slight frame, Tommy had proven himself one of the most capable hikers in the troop, often taking point on difficult sections of trail. Bryan adjusted the heavy pack on his shoulders and consulted the detailed topographical map he had studied countless times in preparation for this expedition. "About 3 miles, Tommy. We'll follow the Highline Trail until it branches toward Grinnell Lake, then take the unmarked path toward our designated backcountry site." He pointed toward a distant ridge where ancient glacial ice caught the early morning sunlight like scattered diamonds. "See that notch between the peaks? That's where we're headed." The group of 12 scouts had been preparing for this advanced wilderness expedition for over 8 months. Unlike their usual car camping trips to developed campgrounds, this 5-day journey would take them deep into the heart of grizzly country, where cell phones became useless artifacts and the nearest road lay more than 15 miles away. Each scout had demonstrated proficiency in advanced outdoor skills: wilderness first aid, bear safety protocols, backcountry navigation, and leave-no-trace principles. Marcus Thompson, the assistant scoutmaster and Bryan's closest friend, brought up the rear of the group, his experienced eyes constantly scanning the forest for any signs of wildlife. At 51, Marcus had spent his career as a wildlife biologist for the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department before retiring to focus on youth education. His graying beard and weathered hands spoke of decades spent in places where humans were merely visitors. He had insisted on carrying the bear spray and the emergency satellite communicator, knowing that in this remote section of Glacier, they were truly on their own. "Remember what we discussed about bear country protocols?" Marcus called out to the group as they navigated a particularly dense section of lodgepole pines. "Stay together, make noise, and keep your food sealed at all times. These mountains are home to some of the largest grizzlies in North America, and they've had very little contact with humans. That makes them unpredictable." 16-year-old Jake Morrison, the troop's senior patrol leader, nodded seriously as he helped younger scout Danny Kowalski adjust his pack straps. Jake had earned his Eagle Scout rank the previous year and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced challenges and emerged stronger. His leadership abilities had been evident since he joined the troop 4 years earlier, and Bryan often relied on him to help manage the younger boys during difficult portions of their adventures. "Mr. Thompson is right," Jake said, addressing the cluster of younger scouts around him. "I've been reading about grizzly behavior, and they can cover ground incredibly fast when they want to. If we encounter one, we follow the protocol exactly. Don't run, don't make eye contact, speak in calm voices, and back away slowly while making ourselves appear as large as possible. A deal." 13-year-old Alex Chen, the troop's newest member, listened intently while taking photographs with his digital camera. Alex had moved to Montana from California just 6 months earlier when his father accepted a position at the university, and this represented his first real wilderness experience. Despite his urban background, he had thrown himself into scouting with remarkable enthusiasm, earning several merit badges in record time and demonstrating a natural aptitude for outdoor skills that impressed even the veteran leaders. "The grizzlies here can weigh up to 800 pounds. added Kevin Brennan, a 15-year-old whose father worked as a park ranger at Yellowstone. Kevin had grown up around wildlife and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of animal behavior that often amazed the adult leaders. They're omnivores, so they'll eat basically anything: berries, roots, fish, small mammals, and carrion. This time of year, they're focused on building up fat reserves for winter hibernation, which means they're especially motivated to find food sources. As the group continued along the narrow trail, the landscape gradually transformed from dense forest to more open alpine meadows dotted with wildflowers. The scent of mountain laurel and pine resin filled the air, occasionally punctuated by the sharp sweetness of wild huckleberries. Brian had chosen this particular route because it offered spectacular views of the Continental Divide, while avoiding the more heavily trafficked areas where inexperienced tourists sometimes created dangerous situations by attempting to photograph wildlife at close range. 15-year-old Ryan Patterson walked near the middle of the group, his naturally quiet demeanor making him an excellent observer of the subtle details that others might miss. He had noticed that the usual complement of squirrels and chipmunks seemed absent from this section of forest, and the few birds they encountered appeared agitated, calling out in sharp alarm notes before disappearing into the canopy. Ryan had developed these observational skills during countless hours spent hunting with his grandfather in the remote forests of northern Idaho, where reading the mood of the wilderness could mean the difference between success and failure. "Something's got the animals spooked," Ryan mentioned quietly to his hiking partner, 14-year-old Sam Rodriguez. Sam had joined the troop 2 years earlier as a shy, overweight kid who struggled with physical challenges, but consistent outdoor activity had transformed him into one of their most reliable team members. His determination to overcome obstacles had inspired younger scouts and earned him the respect of his peers. "Probably just our group passing through," Sam replied, though he too had noticed the unusual silence. "Animals don't like human scent, especially when there are a lot of us moving together." Behind them, twins Matt and Mike Sullivan engaged in their typical good-natured competition, seeing who could identify more species of plants and trees along the trail. At 13, they were identical in appearance, but completely different in personality. Matt approached everything with analytical precision, carefully documenting each discovery in his field notebook, while Mike relied on intuition and enthusiasm, often spotting details that escaped more methodical observers. "That's mountain ash," Matt announced, pointing to a cluster of trees with distinctive compound leaves and bright red berries. "Sorbus scopulina. The berries are a major food source for grizzly bears this time of year." Mike immediately began scanning the surrounding area for signs of bear activity: claw marks on tree bark, disturbed vegetation, or the distinctive cone-shaped excavations that grizzlies create when digging for roots. "I don't see any sign that they've been feeding here recently," he observed, "but that doesn't mean much. Bears can be pretty efficient about cleaning out a food source." The youngest member of their group, 11-year-old Peter Walsh, struggled to keep pace with the older scouts despite his determination not to slow down the expedition. Peter had begged his parents for months to allow him to participate in this advanced trip, arguing that his smaller size and lighter pack would compensate for his shorter legs. Brian had initially been reluctant to include such a young scout, but Peter's preparation and enthusiasm had eventually won over the adult leaders. "Hey, Peter, you doing okay back there?" called out Luke Thompson, Marcus's 14-year-old son, who had inherited his father's natural affinity for wilderness environments. Luke often served as an unofficial bridge between the adult leaders and the younger scouts, possessing enough maturity to understand safety concerns while maintaining the perspective needed to relate to his peers. "I'm fine," Peter replied, though his breathing was becoming labored as they climbed toward higher elevation. "Just need to find my rhythm. My dad always says that endurance is more mental than physical." Brian made a mental note to call for a rest break soon. While he pushed the scouts to challenge themselves, he never wanted to create a situation where fatigue led to poor decision-making. In wilderness environments, small mistakes could cascade into serious problems with frightening speed. He had learned this lesson during his own early scouting experiences, when a moment of inattention had resulted in a near miss with a mountain cliff that still haunted his dreams. The trail began to climb more steeply as they approached a series of switchbacks that would take them up onto a high ridgeline. The vegetation changed noticeably at this elevation, with the towering pines giving way to smaller, hardier species adapted to the harsh conditions found above the tree line. Stunted whitebark pines clung to rocky outcroppings, their gnarled branches sculpted by decades of fierce mountain winds. "Let's take a break here," Brian announced, as they reached a relatively flat section of trail beside a small alpine lake. 15 minutes to rest, hydrate, and grab a snack. Remember to purify any water you take from natural sources, even if it looks crystal clear. The scouts gratefully shrugged off their packs and settled onto sun-warmed rocks around the lake's edge. The water was so clear that they could see trout moving lazily in the depths, their movements creating gentle ripples that caught and reflected the intense mountain sunlight. Several of the boys immediately pulled out their water bottles and began the process of filtering and purifying lake water to refill their supplies. Marcus took advantage of the break to consult his GPS unit and confirm their position. "We're making good time," he reported to Brian, "about 2 hours ahead of our planned schedule, which gives us some flexibility if we run into any obstacles later in the day." "Weather looks stable too," Brian observed, scanning the sky for any signs of the afternoon thunderstorms that frequently developed in the high country. "But we know how quickly that can change up here. I want to get to our campsite and have our shelters set up well before evening." As the scouts rested and refueled, several of them began sharing their observations about the unique ecosystem surrounding them. Alex had been photographing the various wildflower species, creating a visual catalogue that he planned to research further once they returned to civilization. Kevin pointed out the distinctive tracks of mountain goats in the soft soil near the lake's edge, explaining how their specialized hooves allowed them to navigate seemingly impossible cliff faces. "This whole area was carved out by glacial action during the last ice age," explained Jake, who had been studying geology in preparation for his environmental science merit badge. "The lake sits in what's called a cirque, which is basically a bowl-shaped depression created when a glacier slowly ground away the bedrock over thousands of years." Tommy had discovered what appeared to be relatively fresh bear scat near a cluster of berry bushes on the far side of the lake. "Mr. Thompson, could you take a look at this?" he called out. "I think it's from a grizzly, but I'm not sure how old it is." Marcus approached the find with his usual scientific caution, using a stick to examine the scat without disturbing it unnecessarily. "Good eye, Tommy. This is definitely from a large bear, probably within the last day or two based on its condition and the fact that it hasn't been disturbed by other animals." He studied the contents, which consisted primarily of partially digested berries and plant material. "Looks like it's been feeding on the same huckleberries we saw earlier, which is completely normal behavior for this time of year." "Does that mean we should be extra careful in this area?" asked Ryan, his hunter's instincts making him naturally cautious about sharing territory with large predators. "It means we should be extra careful everywhere," Marcus replied. "Bears are individuals just like people. They have different personalities, different comfort levels around humans, and different reactions to stress. The fact that one was feeding here recently doesn't necessarily mean it's still in the immediate area, but it does confirm that we're in active bear habitat." Brian used the opportunity to review their bear safety protocols once more, ensuring that every scout understood the proper procedures for storing food, managing waste, and responding to potential encounters. Remember, bears are naturally afraid of humans in most situations. They have excellent hearing and sense of smell, so they usually know we're coming long before we know they're around. Most of the time they'll move away from our route rather than risk a confrontation. "What if we surprise one?" asked Peter, his young voice betraying a hint of anxiety about the possibilities. "That's why we make noise while we're hiking," Jake explained patiently. "We talk, we sing, we call out when we're going around blind corners or through dense vegetation. The goal is to avoid surprising any wildlife, because surprised animals are much more likely to react defensively." After their rest break, the group resumed their ascent toward the high ridge that would provide access to their designated camping area. The trail became increasingly challenging as they climbed, requiring careful foot placement on loose rock and occasional scrambling over small cliff faces. Brian and Marcus moved up and down the line of scouts, offering encouragement and assistance where needed, while ensuring that safety remained the top priority. The view from the ridgeline was absolutely spectacular, stretching for dozens of miles in every direction across an untouched wilderness that looked much the same as it had when the first explorers entered the region more than a century earlier. Massive peaks rose like ancient cathedrals, their snow-covered summits piercing a sky so intensely blue it almost hurt to look at directly. Far below, pristine lakes reflected the surrounding mountains like perfect mirrors, creating a landscape that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. "This is why we do this," Brian said quietly to Marcus, as they watched their scouts experiencing the raw majesty of the wilderness for perhaps the first time in their lives. "No video game or movie can prepare them for something like this. They'll carry this experience with them for the rest of their lives." The descent from the ridge toward their campsite required even more careful attention to footing, as loose scree and steep angles created the potential for serious falls. Brian had chosen this particular route specifically because it would challenge the scouts while remaining within acceptable risk parameters. But he was acutely aware that wilderness adventures always involved calculated risks that couldn't be completely eliminated. As they dropped back below the tree line, the forest seemed to close around them once again, creating a sense of intimate connection with the natural world that was impossible to achieve in developed areas. The scent of pine resin and wild herbs filled the air, and the soft carpet of fallen needles muffled their footsteps as they moved along the narrow trail. "I can smell our campsite," announced Mike Sullivan, whose sense of smell had always been unusually acute. "There's water nearby and something else. Maybe wood smoke." Marcus immediately became alert at the mention of smoke, since they were in a pristine wilderness area where campfires were strictly regulated and human presence was supposed to be minimal. "Are you sure about the smoke?" he asked, moving forward to investigate. After several minutes of careful observation, Marcus determined that what Mike had detected was not smoke from a human campfire, but rather the distinctive scent that sometimes accompanied natural forest processes. "False alarm," he reported back to the group. "Just the forest being itself." Their designated campsite sat on a small plateau beside a crystal-clear mountain stream, surrounded by towering pines that would provide both shelter and natural windbreaks for their tents. The area had been carefully chosen by park rangers to minimize environmental impact while providing the educational experience that the scouts were seeking. A metal bear box had been installed to provide secure food storage, and a primitive latrine had been constructed at an appropriate distance from both the camp and the water source. "This is perfect," breathed Alex, as he began taking photographs of their new temporary home. "It's like something out of a nature documentary." The scouts immediately began the familiar process of setting up camp, a routine they had practiced countless times during their preparation for this expedition. Each patrol worked together to establish their shelter areas, organize their equipment, and prepare for the evening activities that Brian had planned. Despite their fatigue from the long day of hiking, their enthusiasm remained high as they adapted to their wilderness environment. Brian and Marcus took responsibility for the more complex logistics, checking the bear box for proper operation, testing the satellite communicator to ensure they could reach emergency services if needed, and conducting a detailed inventory of their food supplies and medical equipment. Years of experience had taught them that careful attention to these details during setup could prevent serious problems later in the expedition. "Food storage is critical out here," Marcus explained to the gathered scouts as he demonstrated the proper use of the bear box. "Every single item that has a scent goes in here: food, toiletries, soap, even toothpaste. Bears have an incredibly sensitive sense of smell, and they're naturally curious about anything unusual in their territory." And as evening approached, the temperature began to drop noticeably, reminding everyone that mountain weather could change rapidly, even during summer months. The scouts pulled on additional layers and gathered around the designated camp area for dinner and the evening program that Brian had prepared. "Tonight, we're going to talk about wilderness survival skills," Brian announced as the group settled in for their evening meal of freeze-dried camping food. "Tomorrow, we'll start learning some advanced techniques for navigation, shelter building, and emergency signaling. But first, let's go around the circle and share our thoughts about today's hike." Each scout took turns describing their favorite moments from the day's journey, the spectacular views from the ridge, the wildlife tracks they had discovered, the sense of accomplishment that came from successfully completing a challenging hike. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and even the youngest members of the group spoke with confidence about their experiences. As darkness settled over their campsite, the familiar sounds of the forest began to emerge. The distant call of owls, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, and the gentle murmur of the stream that would provide the soundtrack for their night's sleep. Brian had always found these sounds comforting, a reminder that they were guests in a living ecosystem that continued its ancient rhythms regardless of human presence. "Time for everyone to get settled in their tents," Marcus announced as the evening program concluded. "Remember to use the buddy system if you need to leave your tent for any reason during the night, and make sure all your scented items are properly stored in the bear box." The scouts performed their evening routines with practiced efficiency, brushing teeth with purified water, securing their gear, and organizing their sleeping areas for maximum comfort and warmth. Despite their exhaustion from the long day, several of them continued quiet conversations about their plans for the following day's activities. Brian conducted a final check of the campsite, ensuring that all food items were properly secured and that no trash or scented materials had been inadvertently left accessible to wildlife. This ritual had become second nature over his many years of wilderness leadership, but he never allowed familiarity to breed carelessness when it came to safety protocols. "Good night, everyone," he called out softly as the last of the scouts disappeared into their tents. "Remember, we're sharing this space with the wildlife that calls it home. Be respectful, be quiet, and get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be another big day." As the camp settled into quiet, Marcus made one final check of their emergency equipment. Satellite communicator fully charged and tested, first aid supplies organized and accessible, bear spray properly positioned for immediate use if needed. These precautions were routine, but they represented the difference between a successful wilderness adventure and a potential tragedy. The mountain night was crystal clear, with stars visible in numbers that amazed the urban scouts who had never experienced true darkness unpolluted by artificial light. Several of them lay in their sleeping bags, gazing up through their tent screens at the brilliant display overhead, trying to identify constellations and planets that were invisible from their suburban homes. Brian found himself unable to sleep immediately, despite his physical exhaustion from the day's activities. Something about this particular location felt different from other wilderness areas he had visited, though he couldn't identify any specific cause for concern. The forest sounds seemed normal, the weather was stable, and all their safety protocols had been properly implemented. Perhaps it was simply the responsibility he felt for the 12 young lives under his care, a weight that had grown heavier with each passing year of his leadership role. These parents had entrusted him with their most precious possessions, expecting him to return their sons safely while providing them with experiences that would shape their character and understanding of the natural world. Around midnight, Brian was awakened by an unusual sound, a deep, resonant huffing that seemed to come from the forest beyond their campsite. He lay perfectly still, listening intently while trying to determine whether the sound represented a potential threat or simply another element of the normal forest symphony. After several minutes without repetition, he concluded that it was probably just a deer or elk moving through the area. Marcus, whose decades of wildlife experience had given him highly developed survival instincts, was also awakened by the sound. He recognized it immediately as the breathing pattern of a large mammal, most likely a bear, investigating the unusual scents and sounds associated with human presence. This was not necessarily cause for immediate alarm, since bears frequently checked out campsites from a safe distance before moving on to other areas. The sound was not repeated, and after nearly an hour of careful listening, both adult leaders gradually returned to sleep. Their subconscious minds remained alert to unusual sounds, a survival adaptation that had served them well during countless wilderness adventures over the years. The first day of their expedition had been a complete success by every measure that mattered. All scouts had completed the challenging hike safely. Their campsite was properly established according to wilderness protocols, and enthusiasm remained high for the adventures planned for the following days. Brian felt a familiar sense of satisfaction that came from sharing the wilderness experience with young people who were discovering their own capabilities in an environment that demanded self-reliance and teamwork. Dawn came early at their elevation, with the first rays of sunlight painting the eastern peaks in shades of gold and pink that gradually spread across the entire landscape. The air was crisp and thin, carrying the clean scent of pine and the promise of another spectacular day in the mountains. Brian emerged from his tent to find that several of the scouts were already awake, quietly observing the sunrise and taking photographs of the magnificent scenery surrounding their campsite. "Morning, Mr. Adams," whispered Tommy Martinez, who had apparently been awake for some time. "Did you hear anything unusual during the night?" "I thought I heard something large moving around the camp area, but it might have been my imagination." Brian felt a slight chill at the confirmation that his own observations had been accurate. "I heard something too, Tommy. Probably just a deer or elk checking us out. It's completely normal for wildlife to be curious about visitors to their territory, as long as we follow proper protocols for securing our food and gear." Marcus emerged from his tent at that moment, having overheard the conversation. "Actually, I think it was probably a bear," he said matter-of-factly. "The breathing pattern was distinctive, and the timing fits with typical bear behavior. They often investigate new scents during nighttime hours when they feel safer moving around." Several more scouts had awakened and were listening to this conversation with obvious interest and perhaps a touch of concern. Brian decided to use this as a teaching moment rather than a source of anxiety. "This is exactly why we follow strict food storage protocols," he explained, as more of the group gathered around their designated meeting area. "Bears are naturally curious, but they're also naturally cautious. As long as we don't provide them with any incentive to associate our camp with food sources, they'll typically observe us from a distance and then move on to other areas." "Did anyone actually see it?" asked Ryan Patterson, whose hunting background had taught him to always gather as much information as possible about wildlife activity in the area. No visual contact, Marcus replied. But based on the sound patterns, I'd estimate it was a fairly large bear, probably an adult grizzly. It stayed well outside our immediate camp area, which suggests it was just investigating rather than looking for a confrontation. As the full group assembled for breakfast, Brian used the opportunity to review their bear safety protocols once more. "This is exactly the kind of situation we prepared for," he reminded them. "We're in bear country, so encounters are always possible. The key is to avoid creating situations that might lead to problems." The scouts prepared their breakfast with heightened awareness of the need for proper food handling and cleanup procedures. Every crumb was carefully collected and disposed of properly, and all scented items were immediately returned to the secure bear box after use. This level of attention to detail was exactly what Brian had hoped to instill through their wilderness experience. "Today's plan includes some advanced navigation training," Marcus announced as they finished their morning meal. "We'll split into 3 groups and practice using map and compass to locate specific landmarks in the surrounding area. This will give everyone a chance to apply the skills we've been developing while exploring more of this incredible landscape." The day's activities were designed to build confidence and competence in wilderness skills, while providing multiple opportunities to observe and learn about the natural environment. Brian had structured the program to include both individual challenges and group problem-solving exercises that would require cooperation and communication. Jake Morrison, as the senior patrol leader, took responsibility for organizing the younger scouts into their navigation groups, while the adult leaders prepared the materials and maps that would be needed for the training exercises. His natural leadership abilities and patience with younger boys made him invaluable in situations like this. "Remember, navigation is about more than just following a compass bearing," Jake explained to his assigned group, which included Peter Walsh, Alex Chen, and Matt Sullivan. "You need to constantly check your surroundings, identify landmarks, and adjust your route based on terrain features that might not show up clearly on the map." The first navigation exercise took them along a relatively easy route that followed the stream below their campsite toward a distinctive rock formation that was clearly visible from their starting point. This allowed the scouts to practice basic compass techniques while building confidence in their ability to navigate in wilderness conditions. Alex documented their progress with his camera, creating a visual record of their route that could be used later to discuss navigation decisions and alternative approaches. His urban background had initially made him skeptical about the relevance of wilderness skills, but he was beginning to understand how these abilities connected to broader concepts of self-reliance and problem-solving. "The key is to always know where you are in relation to major landmarks," explained Marcus as he worked with the second navigation group, led by Kevin Brennan and including Tommy Martinez, Sam Rodriguez, and Luke Thompson. "Even if you lose the trail or make a wrong turn, you should always be able to orient yourself and find a safe route back to your starting point." Their route took them up a steep slope toward a high meadow where they could practice taking compass bearings on distant peaks and correlating their observations with the topographical maps they carried. The physical challenge of the climb added an element of realism to the exercise, since navigation decisions often had to be made while dealing with fatigue and other stressors. Brian accompanied the third group, which consisted of the older scouts, Ryan Patterson, Jake Morrison, Mike Sullivan, Danny Kowalski, and the twins Matt and Mike. Their route was the most challenging, requiring them to navigate through dense forest where visibility was limited and terrain features were subtle. "This is more like real-world navigation," Brian explained, as they paused to take compass bearings and check their progress against the map. "In emergency situations, you might not have clear landmarks or obvious trails to follow. You need to trust your instruments and your training, even when your instincts are telling you something different." The exercise was proceeding smoothly when Ryan suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. "There's something moving in the trees ahead of us," he whispered, his hunting experience having taught him to recognize the subtle sounds that indicated the presence of large animals. Brian immediately implemented their wildlife encounter protocols, gathering the scouts into a tight group while he assessed the situation. "Everyone stay calm and stay together," he instructed in a calm, quiet voice. "Make yourselves appear large, but don't make any sudden movements." Through the trees ahead of them, they could see the unmistakable bulk of a large grizzly bear, perhaps 200 yards away, and apparently unaware of their presence. The bear was methodically stripping berries from a large bush, its massive frame moving with surprising grace as it fed. "This is incredible," breathed Mike Sullivan, his voice barely audible. "I've never seen a wild grizzly before." "Remember your training," Brian whispered back. "No sudden movements, no direct eye contact, and be ready to back away slowly if it notices us." He reached for the bear spray attached to his belt, though he hoped they wouldn't need to use it. The bear continued feeding for several more minutes, apparently oblivious to the group of humans watching from what they hoped was a safe distance. Its behavior seemed completely natural and unstressed, which Brian interpreted as a positive sign that they could retreat without creating a confrontation. "We're going to back away very slowly," he announced to his group. "Stay together, face the bear, and move as quietly as possible. We'll take an alternate route back to camp and report this sighting to the other groups." The retreat went smoothly, with the scouts demonstrating excellent discipline and adherence to their training protocols. The bear never showed any indication that it was aware of their presence, continuing to feed peacefully as they gradually increased the distance between themselves and the powerful predator. "That was amazing," said Danny Kowalski, once they had reached what Brian considered a safe distance. "It was so much bigger than I expected, and the way it moved was just incredible." Brian used the encounter as an opportunity to reinforce their understanding of bear behavior and the importance of maintaining appropriate distances from wildlife. That bear was doing exactly what it should be doing, feeding to build up fat reserves for winter hibernation. We were the visitors in its territory, and it was our responsibility to avoid creating any kind of disturbance. When the three navigation groups reconvened at their campsite, the bear sighting became the dominant topic of conversation. The scouts who had not witnessed the encounter listened with fascination as their teammates described the experience, and Brian found himself answering dozens of questions about grizzly behavior, habitat requirements, and conservation status. "Bears like that one can live for 30 years or more in the wild," explained Marcus, drawing on his professional background in wildlife biology. "They have complex social structures, excellent memories, and individual personalities, just like any other intelligent animal. The one you saw today might have been using that feeding area for many years." As the afternoon progressed, Brian noticed subtle changes in the forest around their campsite that suggested increased wildlife activity. Birds seemed more agitated than they had been the previous day, frequently calling out alarm notes before flying away to more distant perches. The usual complement of small mammals also seemed less visible, suggesting that something might be influencing their normal behavior patterns. "Have you noticed how quiet it's been today?" Marcus asked privately, confirming Brian's own observations. "Even during our navigation exercises, we didn't see nearly as much wildlife activity as I would expect in an area like this." I was thinking the same thing, Brian replied. Could be natural variation, or maybe there's been some kind of disturbance in the area that's affecting animal behavior. It's probably nothing to worry about, but we should keep paying attention. As evening approached, the scouts began preparations for their second night in the wilderness. Their confidence had grown significantly since their arrival, and they moved through their camp routines with increased efficiency and attention to detail. The bear sighting had added an element of excitement to their adventure without creating any real sense of danger or anxiety. Dinner conversation revolved around wildlife observations, navigation challenges, and plans for the following day's activities. Several of the scouts expressed interest in learning more about animal tracking, while others wanted to focus on advanced shelter-building techniques using natural materials found in the forest. Tomorrow, we'll work on some primitive skills, Brian announced. Fire building without matches, constructing emergency shelters, and identifying edible plants. These are skills that could potentially save your life if you ever found yourself in a real survival situation. As darkness settled over their campsite for the second time, the familiar sounds of the mountain night began to emerge once again. However, both Brian and Marcus noticed that the soundscape seemed different from the previous evening, less diverse, more muted, and punctuated by occasional alarm calls from birds that should have been roosting quietly. "I'm going to check the perimeter before we all turn in," Marcus announced, though he tried to make it sound like a routine precaution rather than a response to any specific concern. "Just want to make sure everything looks normal." His survey of the area around their campsite revealed several signs that large animals had been moving through the vicinity during the day. Fresh tracks in the soft soil near the stream, broken branches at bare height, and several trees that showed fresh claw marks from what appeared to be territorial marking behavior. "Find anything interesting?" Brian asked when Marcus returned to the main camp area. "Definitely increased bear activity since yesterday," Marcus replied quietly. "Multiple animals based on the track sizes. Could be a sow with cubs, or maybe several individuals that are using this area as part of their regular territory." This information was concerning, but not necessarily alarming. Bears were naturally mobile animals that could cover dozens of miles in a single day, and their presence in the area was to be expected given the abundant food sources and fresh water. The key was to continue following proper protocols while remaining alert to any changes in animal behavior that might indicate potential problems. "Should we consider relocating?" Brian asked, though he was reluctant to disrupt their carefully planned itinerary unless absolutely necessary. "Not based on what I've seen so far," Marcus answered after careful consideration. "We're following all the proper food storage and waste disposal protocols, and we haven't had any direct confrontations. But we should definitely maintain heightened awareness and make sure everyone understands the importance of staying together." As the scouts settled into their tents for their second night in the wilderness, both adult leaders positioned themselves to maintain a more active watch schedule than had been necessary the previous evening. They took turns monitoring the campsite for unusual sounds or movement, though they tried to do so without creating unnecessary anxiety among the younger group members. Around midnight, their vigilance was rewarded when they both detected the distinctive sounds of multiple large animals moving through the forest at the edge of their campsite. This time, the sounds were more complex and lasted for nearly an hour, suggesting that several bears were in the immediate vicinity and possibly interacting with each other. "That's at least 2 different animals," Marcus whispered during a brief consultation outside their tents. "Possibly a mother with an older cub, based on the different footfall patterns and breathing sounds." Brian felt his anxiety level increase significantly at this news. While solitary adult bears were generally predictable in their behavior, sows with cubs represented a much more volatile and potentially dangerous situation. Mother bears were extremely protective of their offspring and much more likely to perceive humans as potential threats requiring aggressive response. "We need to be extra careful tomorrow," he replied. "Cubs mean the mother will be hypersensitive to anything she perceives as a threat to her family. We might want to consider modifying our activity plans to keep the group closer to the immediate camp area." The sounds gradually faded as the bears moved away from their campsite, but both leaders remained alert for the remainder of the night. By dawn, the forest had returned to its normal patterns of sound and activity, with birds beginning their morning songs and small mammals resuming their usual foraging behaviors. "How was everyone's sleep?" Brian asked as the scouts began emerging from their tents to begin their third day in the wilderness. "I heard something moving around outside during the night," reported Luke Thompson. "It sounded pretty big, but I figured it was probably the same bear from the other night." "Actually, we think there were at least 2 bears in the area last night," Marcus explained, deciding that honesty was preferable to concealment when it came to safety issues. "Probably a mother with a cub, which means we need to be extra cautious today." This news generated considerable discussion among the scouts, ranging from excitement at the prospect of potentially observing bear cubs to concern about the increased risk associated with protective mother bears. Brian used the opportunity to review their emergency procedures and ensure that everyone understood the protocols for handling more serious wildlife encounters. "Cubs are incredibly cute, but they represent one of the most dangerous situations you can encounter in bear country," he explained. "Mother bears will defend their cubs against any perceived threat, and they can be very aggressive if they think their babies are in danger. Our job is to make sure we never put them in a position where they feel that way." The day's activities were modified to keep the group closer to their established campsite while still providing valuable learning opportunities. Instead of the wide-ranging navigation exercises that had been planned, they focused on detailed observation and documentation of the immediate area, developing skills in animal tracking, plant identification, and ecological assessment. "Look at this," called out Kevin Brennan from his position near the stream. "These tracks are really fresh, probably from this morning." He pointed to a series of clear paw prints in the soft mud at the water's edge, each one nearly as large as a dinner plate and showing the distinctive claw marks that identified them as grizzly sign. The scouts gathered around the discovery, taking photographs and making detailed measurements of the tracks, while Marcus provided expert commentary on what the sign could tell them about the animal's size, sex, and recent activities. "Based on the size and spacing of these tracks, I'd estimate this bear weighs somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds, he explained. "That's a large adult, but not unusually so for this region." The fact that the tracks are heading downstream suggests the bear was following the watercourse, probably looking for fish or easy crossing points. Tommy Martinez had been exploring the area upstream and called for attention to another significant discovery. "There are more tracks up here, but these look different. Smaller, with a different stride pattern." His find confirmed Marcus's suspicions about a family group in the area. The smaller tracks clearly belonged to a juvenile bear, probably in its 2nd year of life, and still traveling with its mother. This information was both fascinating from an educational standpoint and concerning from a safety perspective. "This is exactly the kind of situation we trained for," Brian reminded the group as they documented their findings. "We're getting an incredible opportunity to observe bear behavior and sign, but we need to be extra careful about maintaining appropriate distances and avoiding any actions that might be interpreted as threatening." The morning's activities provided abundant material for discussion and learning, with each new discovery adding to their understanding of the complex ecosystem surrounding their temporary home. Several scouts expressed amazement at the detailed information that could be gathered from careful observation of tracks, scat, feeding sign, and other evidence of animal activity. As they returned to their campsite for lunch, Alex Chen noticed something unusual about the bear box that secured their food supplies. "Mr. Adams, does this look right to you?" he asked, pointing to what appeared to be fresh scratch marks on the metal surface. Brian and Marcus both examined the bear box carefully, confirming that there were indeed new marks that had not been present during their previous inspections. The scratches appeared to have been made by powerful claws attempting to access the interior of the container, though the security mechanisms had functioned properly and prevented any actual breach. "This is concerning," Marcus admitted privately to Brian. "Bears don't usually spend this much time and effort investigating campsites unless something is motivating them. Either there's an unusual scent attracting them, or we're dealing with individuals that have had previous contact with humans and learned to associate people with food." Brian conducted a thorough inventory of their food supplies and verified that all items were properly sealed and contained within the bear-proof storage system. Nothing appeared to be missing, and there was no evidence that any food had been accessible to the investigating bears. "Could be that one of our food packages has a stronger scent than the others," he theorized. "Or maybe we're just unlucky enough to be camping in an area that's part of their regular travel route. Either way, we need to be extra vigilant." Lunch conversation was dominated by discussion of the bear sign and its implications for their remaining time in the wilderness. Some scouts expressed excitement about the possibility of actually observing the animals they had been tracking, while others showed signs of increasing anxiety about sharing their space with such powerful predators. "Are we in danger?" asked Peter Walsh, his 11-year-old mind struggling to process the competing emotions of adventure and concern that the situation had created. "We're following all the proper safety protocols," Brian assured him. "Bears are wild animals, so there's always some inherent risk when we share their habitat. But these are intelligent creatures that generally want to avoid conflict with humans. As long as we respect their space and don't provide them with any incentives to approach our camp, we should be fine." Jake Morrison, drawing on his leadership experience and natural maturity, helped address some of the younger scouts' concerns. "Think about it this way," he said. "We're getting to experience something that most people never get to see. These bears are just going about their normal lives, and we have the privilege of observing their behavior in completely natural conditions." As the afternoon progressed, the forest around their campsite seemed to become even quieter than it had been earlier in the day. Birds were notably absent from the immediate area, and the usual sounds of small mammals moving through the underbrush had all but disappeared. Both adult leaders recognized these changes as potential indicators that predators were active in the vicinity. "I think we should modify our evening plans," Marcus suggested during a private consultation with Brian. "Instead of the night navigation exercise we had planned, maybe we should focus on campfire activities that will keep everyone close together." Brian agreed with this assessment, though he was reluctant to communicate his concerns too directly to the scouts. "We'll call it a change in program due to interesting wildlife activity in the area," he decided. "That's technically accurate without being alarmist." As evening approached, the group gathered around their designated campfire area for what Brian announced would be an extended session focused on wilderness survival skills and storytelling. The fire provided both practical illumination and psychological comfort, creating a barrier between their small human community and the vast wilderness surrounding them. "Tonight we're going to learn about emergency signaling techniques," Brian began, using the opportunity to cover material that could be vitally important if their situation changed unexpectedly. "If you're ever lost or injured in the wilderness, your ability to attract attention from rescue personnel could literally save your life. The scouts practiced various signaling methods: mirror flashes, whistle codes, ground signals visible from aircraft, and emergency fire techniques that would produce distinctive smoke patterns. While these activities were presented as routine wilderness education, they also served to ensure that everyone would know how to summon help if circumstances required it. As darkness settled over their campsite, the familiar nighttime sounds of the forest failed to emerge with their usual diversity and intensity. The silence was occasionally broken by what sounded like large animals moving through the trees at considerable distances, but the normal chorus of smaller creatures remained notably absent. "It's really quiet tonight," observed Sam Rodriguez, whose developing outdoor senses had begun to notice the subtle changes in their environment. "That's not unusual in bear country," Marcus explained, though he too was concerned by the extent of the silence. When large predators are active in an area, smaller animals often become more cautious about exposing themselves. It's a natural survival response. Around 10 o'clock, as the scouts were preparing to retire to their tents, a series of sounds emerged from the forest that caused both adult leaders to become immediately alert. Deep, resonant calls that could only be coming from very large animals echoed through the darkness, seeming to originate from multiple directions around their campsite. "What was that?" asked several scouts simultaneously, their voices betraying anxiety that had been building throughout the day. "Those are bear vocalizations," Marcus explained, trying to maintain a calm tone despite his own growing concerns. "They're communicating with each other, probably coordinating their movements through the area." The sounds continued for nearly 20 minutes, with what appeared to be at least 3 different animals calling back and forth across the darkness. The complexity and duration of the communication suggested social interaction among bears that was far more sophisticated than most people realized possible. "Should we be worried?" asked Ryan Patterson, whose hunting background had given him enough experience with large predators to recognize when normal behavior patterns were being exceeded. "We should be alert and careful," Brian replied, choosing his words thoughtfully. "This level of bear activity is unusual, but not necessarily dangerous as long as we continue following our safety protocols." As the bear calls gradually faded and the forest returned to its unnatural silence, Brian made the decision to implement a more formal watch schedule for the remainder of the night. "Marcus and I are going to take turns staying awake tonight," he announced to the group. "It's just a precaution, but I want everyone to know that we're taking the situation seriously." The scouts settled into their tents with considerably less of the relaxed chatter that had characterized their previous evenings. While none of them voiced serious fear about their situation, the accumulating signs of intense bear activity had created an undercurrent of tension that was affecting everyone's mood. Brian took the first watch, positioning himself where he could observe the entire campsite while remaining close enough to the bear spray and satellite communicator to respond quickly if circumstances required emergency action. The night was clear and calm, with brilliant stars providing enough illumination to detect movement in the surrounding forest. Around midnight, his vigilance was rewarded when he detected the unmistakable bulk of a large bear moving slowly along the stream approximately 50 yards from their campsite. The animal appeared to be following the watercourse rather than approaching their location directly, but its proximity was far closer than any of the previous sightings. Brian remained motionless, watching as the bear paused frequently to investigate scents and sounds that were undetectable to human senses. After nearly 10 minutes of careful observation, he was startled to realize that a second bear had appeared near the first, confirming that they were indeed dealing with multiple animals in the immediate vicinity. The 2 bears appeared to be communicating through low-frequency vocalizations that were barely audible to human ears. Their body language suggested calm interaction rather than aggressive confrontation, but their continued presence near the campsite was highly unusual and potentially problematic. When Marcus took over the watch at 2 in the morning, Brian briefed him on his observations and expressed his growing concerns about the situation they were facing. "I've never seen this level of bear interest in a campsite that was properly managed," he admitted. "Either we're dealing with animals that have been habituated to human food sources, or there's something about this location that's attracting them." Marcus spent his watch period conducting careful observations of the forest around their campsite, using night vision techniques he had developed during his years as a wildlife biologist. His expertise allowed him to detect subtle signs of animal movement that would be invisible to less experienced observers. Shortly before dawn, he witnessed what appeared to be 3 separate bears moving through the area in coordinated fashion, suggesting either a family group with an older cub or possibly a temporary association between normally solitary animals. This behavior was highly unusual and indicated that their campsite had become a focal point for bear activity in ways that could potentially escalate into dangerous confrontations. "We need to seriously consider our options," Marcus told Brian when the dawn watch change occurred. "This level of interest from multiple bears is outside the range of normal behavior patterns. Something is drawing them to this specific location, and that creates risks that we may not be able to manage with standard protocols." As the 4th day of their wilderness expedition began, both adult leaders were faced with difficult decisions about how to balance the educational value of their experience against the increasing evidence that they were dealing with an unusual and potentially dangerous wildlife situation. The scouts emerged from their tents to find their leaders engaged in serious consultation over maps and emergency communication equipment. While neither Brian nor Marcus wanted to create unnecessary panic, they recognized their responsibility to prioritize safety over all other considerations. "What's the situation?" asked Jake Morrison, whose maturity and leadership experience had taught him to recognize when adults were dealing with serious problems. "We had multiple bears in the immediate area last night," Brian explained honestly. "More activity than we would normally expect, and closer to our campsite than is typical. We're evaluating our options for how to proceed with the remainder of our trip." This announcement generated immediate discussion among the scouts, with opinions ranging from excitement about the unique wildlife experience to concern about potential dangers. Several of the older boys expressed confidence in their leaders' ability to manage whatever challenges they might face, while some of the younger scouts seemed ready to return to safer environments. "Could we move to a different campsite?" suggested Tommy Martinez, whose practical nature led him to focus on potential solutions rather than problems. "That's one option we're considering," Marcus replied, "but we would need to be careful that we don't move into territory that might have even more bear activity. Sometimes the problem you know is safer than the problem you don't know." As they prepared breakfast with heightened attention to food handling protocols, Brian used the satellite communicator to contact park rangers and report their observations. While their situation did not yet constitute an emergency requiring immediate rescue, he wanted official personnel to be aware of the unusual bear activity in case circumstances deteriorated further. The conversation with park headquarters provided some additional context for their situation. "You're in an area that's been experiencing higher than normal bear activity for the past 2 weeks, the ranger informed him. "We've had several reports of aggressive behavior and close encounters with campers. We're considering temporary closure of that section of the park." And this information was both reassuring and alarming. Reassuring because it confirmed that their experiences were part of a larger pattern rather than poor decision-making on their part, but alarming because it suggested that the situation might be more serious than they had initially realized. "What's the recommended course of action for groups currently in the area?" Brian asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Our official recommendation is evacuation to developed areas until we can assess the situation more thoroughly," the ranger replied. "We don't want to interrupt your educational program unnecessarily, but safety has to be the top priority." After discussing the ranger's recommendations with Marcus and consulting with Jake Morrison as the senior scout representative, Brian made the difficult decision to end their wilderness expedition 2 days earlier than planned. While this would significantly reduce the educational value of their trip, it was clearly the responsible choice given the official assessment of increased risk in their area. "We're going to pack up camp and hike out today," he announced to the assembled group. "This isn't because anyone did anything wrong, and it's not because we're afraid. It's because the Ranger Service has identified unusual bear activity throughout this region, and the responsible thing to do is to remove ourselves from a potentially dangerous situation." The scouts received this news with mixed emotions. Some were clearly disappointed at the early end to their adventure, while others seemed relieved to be leaving an increasingly tense situation. All of them recognized the seriousness of the decision and began packing their gear with unusual efficiency and attention to detail. As they prepared to break camp, several discoveries reinforced the wisdom of their decision to evacuate. Fresh bear tracks were found within 10 feet of their sleeping area, indicating that animals had approached much closer during the night than either of the adult leaders had realized. Additionally, the bear box showed new evidence of attempted access, with deeper scratches and what appeared to be bite marks on the metal surfaces. "These bears are definitely more persistent and aggressive than normal," Marcus observed as he documented the damage with his camera. "This kind of sustained interest in human food sources usually indicates animals that have been previously rewarded for approaching campsites." The hike out of the wilderness required careful attention to noise-making and group cohesion, since they would be traveling through the same areas where they had observed increased bear activity during their ascent. Brian and Marcus positioned themselves at the front and rear of the group, maintaining constant communication and watching for any signs of wildlife that might require immediate response. "Stay together and keep talking," Brian reminded everyone as they began their descent toward the trailhead. "We want any bears in the area to know exactly where we are and that we're moving away from their territory." The forest seemed different during their departure hike, with an atmosphere of tension that had been absent during their arrival several days earlier. The usual complement of birds and small mammals remained notably scarce, and the few animals they did encounter appeared agitated and quick to flee from human contact. About halfway through their descent, Ryan Patterson noticed movement in the forest ahead of them that caused him to immediately signal for a halt. "Large animal ahead," he announced quietly, using the hand signals they had practiced during their wilderness training. Through the trees, they could see the unmistakable bulk of an adult grizzly bear, positioned directly on the trail they needed to follow to reach the trailhead. The bear appeared to be feeding on berries, but its location created a potential confrontation that would require careful management to avoid escalation. "Everyone stay calm and stay together," Brian instructed while he assessed their options. "We're going to wait here while the bear finishes whatever it's doing and hopefully moves on." The bear continued feeding for nearly 20 minutes, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by the group of humans watching from what they hoped was a safe distance. Its behavior appeared natural and unstressed, but its location on their exit route created a significant obstacle to their planned departure from the wilderness. "We could try to go around it," suggested Marcus, consulting his topographical map for alternative routes. "There's a game trail that should allow us to bypass this area, but it would add several hours to our hike and take us through unfamiliar terrain." Or we could try to encourage it to move along, Brian replied, though he was reluctant to take any action that might be interpreted as aggressive or threatening by the powerful predator. Before they could implement either strategy, the bear suddenly raised its head and looked directly toward their location. For several tense moments, human and animal regarded each other across the forest clearing, each apparently evaluating the intentions and potential threat level of the other. The bear's body language remained relaxed, suggesting that it was curious rather than threatened by their presence. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, it returned to its feeding activities while maintaining occasional glances toward the group of humans. "I think we can pass safely if we give it plenty of space and avoid direct eye contact," Brian decided after careful consideration of their options. "We'll move very slowly and stay together, making enough noise so it always knows where we are." The passage around the feeding bear required extreme care and patience, with the group moving in single file while maintaining constant awareness of the animal's location and behavior. The bear continued feeding, but clearly tracked their movement, occasionally stopping to watch their progress without showing any signs of aggression or alarm. "That was incredible," whispered Alex Chen once they had safely passed the bear and continued their descent toward the trailhead. "I got some amazing photographs, and the bear seemed completely comfortable with us being there." "That's exactly how these encounters should go," Marcus explained. "Mutual awareness, mutual respect, and no one feeling threatened or cornered. That bear assessed us as non-threatening and went back to its normal activities, which is the best possible outcome." The remainder of their hike passed without further wildlife encounters, though they continued to observe sign of heavy bear activity throughout the area. Fresh tracks, feeding sign, and territorial markings confirmed the ranger's assessment that this region was experiencing unusually high levels of grizzly bear activity. When they finally reached the trailhead and their waiting vehicles, the scouts were exhausted but exhilarated by their wilderness experience. Despite the early termination of their expedition, they had gained invaluable knowledge about wildlife behavior, wilderness survival skills, and their own capabilities in challenging natural environments. "This has been an incredible learning experience," Brian reflected as they loaded their packs and prepared for the drive back to civilization. "You've all demonstrated excellent judgment, courage, and teamwork under circumstances that would challenge much more experienced outdoors people." As they drove away from the wilderness area, several scouts expressed interest in planning future expeditions that would allow them to continue developing their outdoor skills. The encounter with the grizzly bears, rather than discouraging their enthusiasm for wilderness adventures, had deepened their appreciation for the complex relationships between humans and wildlife. "I want to learn more about animal behavior," announced Kevin Brennan. "Understanding how wildlife thinks and reacts could be really important for anyone who spends time in natural environments." "The tracking skills we developed were amazing," added Tommy Martinez. "Being able to read the signs that animals leave behind is like having a conversation with creatures we never actually see." The expedition had ended differently than planned, but it had provided lessons and experiences that would influence these young men for the rest of their lives. They had faced genuine challenges, made difficult decisions under pressure, and learned to trust in their training and leadership when confronted with potentially dangerous situations. Back at their home base, as parents arrived to collect their sons and hear stories about the adventure, Brian and Marcus conducted their standard post-expedition debrief. The unusual circumstances they had encountered would require careful documentation and analysis to improve their future wilderness programming. "The bear activity we observed was definitely outside normal parameters," Marcus concluded. "But our safety protocols worked exactly as designed, and everyone demonstrated excellent judgment under pressure." "The early termination was disappointing from an educational standpoint," Brian added, "but it was absolutely the right decision given the information we had available. The boys learned important lessons about risk assessment and decision-making that they wouldn't have gotten from a routine camping trip. Over the following weeks, several of the scouts maintained contact with park rangers to track developments in the area where they had camped. The region was indeed closed to overnight camping for the remainder of the summer season, while wildlife officials investigated the unusual bear behavior patterns. Their expedition had provided them with a rare glimpse into the complex world of large predators and the delicate balance required for humans and wildlife to coexist safely in shared environments. The experience would influence their attitudes toward conservation, wilderness management, and personal responsibility in natural settings for years to come. 6 months later, when park officials determined that the bear activity had returned to normal levels, several members of Troop 447 began planning a return expedition to complete the wilderness experience that had been interrupted by their encounter with the grizzly bears. This time, their preparation would incorporate everything they had learned about reading environmental signs, managing risk, and making difficult decisions under pressure. The last trail had indeed been their last trail in that particular wilderness area during that specific time period, but it had opened pathways to deeper understanding and appreciation of the natural world that would guide their adventures for many years to come. They had learned that wilderness experiences involve genuine risks that require careful management, but also that proper preparation, good judgment, and mutual respect between humans and wildlife could create opportunities for incredible learning and personal growth. Their story would be told and retold within the scouting community as an example of how proper training, responsible leadership, and careful attention to changing conditions could transform a potentially dangerous situation into an invaluable educational experience. The bears they had encountered were simply going about their natural lives in their ancestral territory, and the humans had been privileged visitors who learned to appreciate the complexity and power of the natural world while maintaining appropriate respect for its inherent dangers. The next stories. The Last Howl of Kettle Creek. The morning fog clung to Kettle Creek like a shroud, its wispy tendrils curling around the ancient Douglas firs that had stood sentinel over these Montana wilderness valleys for centuries. Dr. Sarah Whitmore adjusted her field-pack straps and breathed in the crisp September air, tasting the metallic hint of early frost that promised winter wasn't far behind. At 38, she had spent the better part of her career studying predator-prey relationships in remote wilderness areas, but something about this particular research expedition felt different. Perhaps it was the unusually aggressive behavior patterns the local rangers had been reporting, or maybe it was the way the ravens seemed to be watching everything with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. "You sure about those coordinates, Doc?" Marcus Rivera called from behind her, his weathered face creased with concern as he consulted the GPS device clipped to his belt. At 52, Marcus had been guiding researchers and hunters through the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex for over 2 decades, and his instincts about the backcountry had kept dozens of people alive in situations that could have easily gone the other way. He had the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly how quickly things could turn deadly in country like this, where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride away on a good day, and completely unreachable when the weather turned nasty. Sarah nodded, pulling out her own GPS to double-check their position. The radio collar signals are definitely coming from somewhere in the Kettle Creek drainage. According to the data from the Fish and Wildlife Service, Bear 447 has been spending an unusual amount of time in this specific area for the past 3 weeks. She paused, studying the topographic map spread across a fallen log. "What concerns me is that this location doesn't fit the typical habitat preferences we've documented for this individual. She's a sow with cubs, and normally she'd be ranging much higher in elevation this time of year, fattening up for winter hibernation. The research team had been tracking Bear 447, a mature female grizzly, for 2 seasons as part of a comprehensive study on post-denning behavior and habitat utilization. The bear, estimated to weigh nearly 400 pounds, had been fitted with a satellite collar the previous spring when she emerged from her den with 2 yearling cubs. Her movement patterns had been relatively predictable until late August, when something had changed dramatically. Instead of following the typical seasonal migration to higher elevation berry patches and white bark pine stands, she had descended into the valley bottom and established what appeared to be a semi-permanent territory around Kettle Creek. "Maybe she found a really good food source down here," suggested Tommy Chen, the youngest member of their group at 26. Fresh out of graduate school with a degree in wildlife biology, Tommy approached every aspect of fieldwork with an enthusiasm that sometimes made the more experienced researchers nervous. He had grown up in San Francisco, and while he was physically fit and technically competent, he lacked the intuitive understanding of wilderness dangers that came from a lifetime spent in remote places. "Could be a spawning run that's running later than usual, or maybe someone's been feeding her." "That's what worries me," Marcus muttered, shouldering his pack and checking the bear spray canister on his belt for probably the 10th time that morning. "A habituated bear is a dangerous bear, especially one with cubs to protect. And if she's associating this area with an easy food source—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone on the team knew the statistics about human-bear encounters in situations where conditioning had occurred. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the senior wildlife veterinarian accompanying the expedition, looked up from her equipment check. At 45, she had spent her career dealing with problematic wildlife situations, and her experience had taught her to trust her instincts even when the data suggested otherwise. "The concerning thing is the timing," she said, her voice thoughtful. "September is typically when bears are most focused on hyperphagia, putting on as much weight as possible before winter. If she's not following normal foraging patterns, there has to be a compelling reason." The team had been hiking for 3 hours through increasingly dense timber, following an old game trail that paralleled Kettle Creek as it wound deeper into the wilderness. The forest around them was a mixture of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and Engelmann spruce, with an understory of huckleberry, serviceberry, and mountain ash. Under normal circumstances, this would be prime grizzly habitat during the fall season. But something felt off about the entire ecosystem. The usual sounds of the forest, bird calls, the chittering of squirrels, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, were conspicuously absent. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is out here?" asked Jennifer Park, the expedition's photographer and videographer. At 32, she had documented wildlife behavior in some of the world's most remote locations, from the Arctic tundra to the Amazon rainforest, and she had developed a keen sense for when environments were functioning normally versus when something was disrupting the natural order. Her cameras and recording equipment were designed to capture behavior that human observers might miss, and she had already noticed several subtle indicators that the local wildlife was exhibiting stress responses. Dr. Robert Ashford, the expedition's senior researcher and Sarah's mentor, paused to examine some broken branches on a serviceberry bush. At 61, he had been studying bear behavior longer than anyone currently working in the field, and his published research had shaped wildlife management policies across North America. His weathered hands traced the claw marks in the bark of a nearby aspen tree, and his expression grew increasingly troubled as he measured the height and spacing of the scratches. "These markings are fresh," he said quietly, "within the last 24 hours, and they're higher than what we'd expect from a typical adult female." The implications of this observation sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Claw marks at that height suggested either an unusually large bear or a bear that was exhibiting aggressive territorial behavior, Either possibility presented significant safety concerns for a research team operating in remote terrain. Marcus studied the scratches with the eye of someone who had learned to read sign the way others read books. "Could be a big boar moving through the area," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. "But the timing doesn't make sense. This is still sow and cub season. A mature male wouldn't typically be marking territory in an area where a female with offspring was established." The team continued deeper into the drainage, documenting sign and taking GPS waypoints as they followed what appeared to be a well-used bear trail. The vegetation showed clear evidence of repeated passage by large animals, broken branches, compressed soil, and browse damage on berry bushes. But there were other signs too, things that didn't fit the typical patterns of bear activity that any of them had observed in their collective decades of field research. "Look at this," Tommy called from about 20 yards ahead, where the trail crossed a small clearing. He was kneeling beside what appeared to be a cache site, a depression in the ground covered with dead branches and forest debris. The acrid smell that rose from the disturbed earth made several team members step backward involuntarily. "Is this normal behavior for grizzlies?" Dr. Ashford approached carefully, studying the site from multiple angles before getting close enough to examine it in detail. His face was grave as he noted the size and construction of the cache, as well as the partially decomposed remains that were visible beneath the covering material. "This is highly unusual," he said finally. "Grizzlies will occasionally cache large carcasses, but typically only during late fall when temperatures are consistently cold enough to prevent spoilage. The construction of this cache and the fact that it's been maintained over multiple visits suggests behavior that we don't normally see in this species." Jennifer began documenting the site with her cameras, while Dr. Reeves collected samples for later analysis. The veterinarian's expression was increasingly concerned as she examined the remains, noting details about condition, decomposition state, and evidence of scavenging that would provide crucial information about the timeline and circumstances surrounding whatever had created this cache. "We need to be extremely careful here," Sarah said, studying the GPS coordinates and comparing them to the locations where they had been receiving signals from Bear 447's collar. "We're less than a quarter-mile from where the bear was last located, and if she's exhibiting this kind of territorial caching behavior, she's going to be highly protective of the area." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the forest canopy at an angle that suggested they were running out of daylight, and Marcus was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with their situation. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when conditions were aligning for potential problems, and every instinct he had developed during his time in the wilderness was telling him that they needed to reconsider their approach. "Doc, I think we need to talk about pulling back and reassessing," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came from having guided people safely through thousands of miles of backcountry terrain. "The sign we're seeing, the behavior indicators, the way the whole ecosystem seems stressed, this doesn't feel like a situation where we want to be caught on foot as darkness approaches." Sarah understood Marcus's concerns, and under normal circumstances she would have deferred to his judgment without question. But the data they were collecting was potentially groundbreaking, and the opportunity to observe and document this kind of aberrant behavior in a wild grizzly population might not come again. The scientific value of continuing their research had to be weighed against the very real risks involved in operating in an area where a large predator was exhibiting unpredictable patterns. "Let's set up a temporary observation post," she suggested, pointing to a rocky outcrop about 50 yards upslope from their current position. "We can establish a secure location with good visibility and multiple escape routes, monitor the collar signals, and see if we can document any behavioral patterns without directly confronting the bear. Dr. Reeves finished collecting her samples and rejoined the group, her expression thoughtful as she processed what they had discovered. The decomposition patterns I'm seeing suggest this cache has been active for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer, she reported. More importantly, the construction and maintenance indicate a level of behavioral sophistication that we don't typically associate with grizzly bears. This animal is planning ahead, modifying her environment, and returning to check on cached resources at regular intervals. The implications of this observation were significant from both a research and safety perspective. A bear that was exhibiting this level of complex territorial behavior would be highly motivated to defend her established area against any perceived threats, and a research team operating within her territory would definitely be perceived as a threat. Tommy had been monitoring the telemetry equipment, and his readings were indicating that Bear 447 was moving closer to their location. "The signal strength is increasing," he reported, his voice tight with a combination of excitement and apprehension. "Based on the antenna direction and signal intensity, she's probably within 200 yards of our current position." The team moved quickly to establish their observation post, setting up spotting scopes, cameras, and monitoring equipment while maintaining strict noise discipline and staying alert for any signs of an approaching bear. Marcus positioned himself where he could watch their back trail and potential escape routes, while the researchers focused on documenting whatever behavior they might be able to observe. As the afternoon wore on, they began to detect subtle signs of bear activity in the area around the cache site. Branches moved in ways that couldn't be attributed to wind. Distant sounds of breaking vegetation suggested something large moving through the forest, and twice they caught brief glimpses of dark fur through the trees. But the bear herself remained elusive, exhibiting the kind of cautious behavior that suggested she was aware of their presence and was evaluating the situation from a position of concealment. "She knows we're here, Doctor," Ashford observed quietly, studying the movement patterns through his binoculars. "The question is whether she's going to choose fight or flight as her response to our intrusion into what she clearly considers her territory." The answer came sooner than any of them expected. A low, rumbling vocalization echoed through the forest, not quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something in between that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. It was a sound that bypassed rational thought and triggered something deep and primitive in the human brain, a recognition of predator threat that had been hardwired into the species through millions of years of evolution. "That's not normal bear vocalization," Dr. Reeves whispered, her face pale as she consulted her behavioral references. "I've never heard anything quite like that from a grizzly, and I've been working with these animals for 20 years. The sound came again, closer this time, and accompanied by the unmistakable crack of breaking branches as something very large moved through the dense timber directly toward their position. Marcus was already reaching for his bear spray while simultaneously calculating distances to the various escape routes he had identified when they first established the observation post. "Everyone stay calm and stay together," Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to surge through her system. "Remember the protocols. Make ourselves appear large, speak in calm, firm voices, and be prepared to deploy deterrence if necessary. Do not run unless I specifically give that command." Bear 447 emerged from the forest like something out of a nightmare. She was significantly larger than the researchers had expected based on their previous data, probably weighing close to 500 pounds rather than the 400 they had estimated. Her dark brown coat was thick and glossy with the weight she had gained during the fall feeding season, but there was something wrong with her posture and movement that became apparent as soon as she was fully visible. The bear's head was held lower than normal, and her ears were pinned back in a display of aggression that any wildlife biologist would recognize as a warning sign. But more disturbing than her threatening posture was her behavior as she approached the cache site. Instead of the typical cautious investigation that a bear would normally exhibit when returning to a food source in the presence of potential competitors, she moved with a purposeful directness that suggested she was not concerned about threats to her safety. "Where are her cubs?" Jennifer whispered, continuing to film despite the danger of their situation. Throughout their research, Bear 447 had been consistently observed with 2 yearling offspring, and their absence was both puzzling and potentially ominous. A sow grizzly's behavior was largely dictated by the need to protect her cubs, and without that behavioral constraint, she would be far more likely to exhibit aggressive territorial responses. The bear began investigating the cache site with an intensity and focus that was disturbing to observe. She didn't just check the covering material and sniff for signs of interference. She methodically examined every inch of the area, following scent trails and investigating disturbances with the thoroughness of a crime scene investigator. Her behavior suggested an intelligence and purposefulness that went beyond typical ursine food caching activities. "She's not just protecting a food source," Dr. Ashford observed, his voice barely audible as he continued to document the bear's behavior through his spotting scope. "She's guarding something specific. Look at the way she's examining the perimeter of the cache. That's territorial marking behavior, but it's more complex than anything I've seen documented in the literature." The bear paused in her investigation and lifted her massive head, testing the air currents with obvious deliberation. Her black nose worked constantly, processing the complex array of scents that would tell her everything she needed to know about the current status of her territory. When she finally located the source of the human scent, her reaction was immediate and unambiguous. Instead of the typical defensive posturing that researchers had observed in thousands of human-bear encounters, Bear 447 oriented directly toward their observation post and began moving in their direction with purposeful determination. There was no huffing, no jaw-popping, no bluff charging, behaviors that bears typically use to warn potential threats before resorting to direct aggression. She simply began approaching their position with the steady, inexorable pace of a predator that had identified prey. "This is not normal defensive behavior," Dr. Reeves said, her voice tight with fear as she began backing away from the edge of their rocky outcrop. "She's not trying to drive us away from her territory. She's actively hunting us." Marcus had seen enough. 20-plus years of guiding people through bear country had taught him to recognize the difference between a defensive animal and a predatory one, and everything about Bear 447's approach triggered every alarm bell in his experienced brain. "We need to move now," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose judgment had kept people alive in situations just like this one. "Grab essential gear only and head for the escape route we identified upslope." The team began moving as quickly as they could while maintaining the discipline necessary to avoid triggering a charge response from the approaching bear. But Bear 447's behavior continued to defy all established protocols for human-bear encounters. Instead of being deterred by their movement, she actually increased her pace, closing the distance between them with a speed that was terrifying to witness in an animal of her size. "She's not exhibiting any of the warning behaviors," Sarah observed, her scientific mind continuing to analyze the situation even as her survival instincts were screaming at her to run. "No vocalizations, no threat displays, no hesitation. It's like she's made a decision and is acting on it without any of the normal behavioral precursors." Tommy stumbled over a loose rock as the team made their way up the increasingly steep slope, and the sound of his equipment bag hitting the ground seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence of the forest. Bear 447's reaction was immediate. She broke into a ground-covering lope that closed the remaining distance between them with shocking speed. "Bear spray!" Marcus yelled, deploying his canister as the massive grizzly approached their position. The pressurized capsaicin spray created a wide cloud of deterrent that should have stopped any bear in its tracks, but Bear 447 merely slowed her approach slightly and altered her angle of attack to avoid the worst of the chemical cloud. The next few moments passed with the surreal clarity that often accompanies life-threatening situations. Time seemed to slow down as adrenaline sharpened every sense and focused every thought on survival. The bear's massive form filled their vision as she closed the final few yards, her dark eyes fixed on their group with an intensity that was both intelligent and utterly alien. Dr. Ashford, despite his age and the terror of the situation, positioned himself between the bear and the younger members of the team. His bear spray canister was in his hands, but he was waiting for the optimal moment to deploy it. Too early, and the spray would be ineffective. Too late, and it wouldn't matter. His decades of experience studying these animals had given him an understanding of their capabilities that was both invaluable and terrifying in their current situation. Bear 447 reared up on her hind legs as she reached their position, towering over the research team at a height of nearly 8 feet. From this position, she could evaluate threats, plan her attack, and demonstrate the overwhelming physical advantage she possessed over any human adversary. The sight of a massive grizzly bear at full height, backlit by the afternoon sun filtering through the forest canopy, was something that would be burned into the memory of every survivor for the rest of their lives. The bear's vocalization from this position was unlike anything any of them had heard before. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from somewhere primal and ancient, a sound that spoke of intelligence, fury, and utterly implacable intent. It was not the sound of an animal defending territory or protecting cubs, but something far more disturbing, the sound of a predator announcing its dominance over prey. Marcus made the decision that probably saved their lives. Instead of waiting for the bear to drop back to all fours and charge, he deployed his second canister of bear spray directly into Bear 447's face and chest, while she was still in the vulnerable upright position. The chemical deterrent had maximum effect at this range and angle, and the bear's reaction was immediate and violent. Bear 447 dropped back to all fours with a roar of pain and fury, pouring at her face and eyes as the capsaicin burned her sensitive nasal passages and temporarily blinded her. But instead of retreating, she began charging in random directions, crashing through the forest with the kind of destructive force that only a pain-maddened animal of her size could generate. "Move! Move! Move!" Marcus shouted, pushing the research team toward the escape route he had identified earlier, a steep, rocky slope that would be difficult for a bear to navigate at speed. The team scrambled up the treacherous terrain, using roots and rock outcrops to pull themselves higher, while the sounds of the bear's rampage echoed through the forest below them. Jennifer continued filming even as they climbed, her professional instincts overriding her personal fear as she documented behavior that had never been recorded in wild grizzly bears. The footage she was capturing would eventually revolutionize the understanding of ursine intelligence and territorial behavior. But at the moment, her only thought was capturing evidence of what might be their final moments. The escape route Marcus had chosen led to a series of rock ledges that were accessible to humans, but would present significant challenges for a bear of Bear 447's size. The team pulled themselves up onto the first ledge just as the effects of the bear spray began to wear off, and Bear 447 located their scent trail. Her pursuit was relentless and methodical. following their path with the kind of determination that suggested this was no longer about territorial defense. It had become personal. "She's still coming," Tommy reported, looking back down the slope at the massive form of the grizzly as she began navigating the rocky terrain with surprising agility. "How is she doing that? I thought bears couldn't climb steep rock faces." "They can't, usually," Dr. Reeves replied grimly, "but she's not behaving like a normal bear. Everything we think we know about grizzly behavior is being rewritten by what we're observing today." The team continued climbing, their movements becoming increasingly desperate as they realized that their pursuer was gaining ground despite the challenging terrain. Bear 447 was using her massive claws and incredible strength to pull herself up rock faces that should have been impossible for an animal of her bulk to navigate, displaying both intelligence and determination that went far beyond anything documented in the scientific literature. Dr. Ashford was beginning to fall behind, his 61-year-old body struggling with the physical demands of their desperate climb. Sarah dropped back to help her mentor, providing support and encouragement as they worked their way up the increasingly vertical rock face. The sound of Bear 447's claws scraping against stone was getting closer, and they all knew that their lead was measured in minutes rather than miles. "There's a cave system up ahead," Marcus called from above, where he had reached a narrow ledge that provided a temporary respite from their climb. "If we can reach it, we might be able to find a defensive position that she can't access." The cave entrance was barely visible from their current position, a dark opening in the rock face that was partially concealed by vegetation and accessible only through a narrow chimney in the stone. It would be a challenging climb for humans and hopefully impossible for a bear, even one that was displaying the kind of unusual climbing ability they were witnessing. One by one, the team members squeezed through the narrow opening into the cave system beyond. The interior was larger than the entrance had suggested, with multiple chambers and passages that extended back into the mountainside. Emergency lighting from their equipment revealed a space that had clearly been used by wildlife for generations. The floor was covered with the bones and remains of various animals, and the walls showed evidence of claw marks from multiple species. "We need to get as far back into the system as possible," Marcus advised, leading the way deeper into the cave complex. "And we need to find a position where we can defend a narrow opening if she manages to follow us inside." The team moved through the cave system in single file, using their headlamps to navigate the treacherous footing and avoid the numerous obstacles scattered across the floor. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of decay and wild animal musk that spoke of the cave's long history as a shelter for the region's wildlife. Behind them, the sound of Bear 447's approach echoed through the cave entrance. Scraping claws, heavy breathing, and occasional vocalizations that suggested she was investigating the opening but had not yet decided whether to attempt entry. The team held their breath as they listened to her movements, hoping that the narrow entrance would discourage her from pursuing them into the confined space. "She's testing the opening," Jennifer whispered, continuing to record despite the low light conditions. "Listen to the way she's investigating. That's problem-solving behavior. She's trying to determine whether she can fit through the entrance." The sounds from the cave mouth continued for several more minutes before falling silent, a silence that was somehow more ominous than the earlier sounds of pursuit. Bear 447 had made a decision about whether to continue her chase, and the team had no way of knowing what that decision was until it was too late to change their defensive position. Dr. Ashford was using the respite to catch his breath and assess their situation. At his age, the physical demands of their escape had pushed him close to his limits, and he was concerned about his ability to continue if they were forced to resume their flight. "We need to consider our options," he said quietly. We can't stay in here indefinitely, and we don't know if she's waiting outside or if she's given up the chase. Sarah was monitoring their GPS equipment, trying to determine their exact position and calculate their distance from the nearest trail or road. The cave system was located deep in the wilderness, miles from any established hiking routes, and even farther from motorized access. Even if they managed to avoid further contact with Bear 447, they faced a challenging multi-day hike to reach safety. "The GPS is showing some interference from the rock formations," she reported, "but I'm estimating we're approximately 12 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. If we can navigate back to Kettle Creek and follow it downstream, we should intersect the main trail system within 6 to 8 miles. Tommy was monitoring their radio communications, hoping to establish contact with the outside world and request assistance. But the combination of their remote location, the surrounding terrain, and the interference from the cave system was making radio contact impossible. They were completely on their own, with no way to call for help and no guarantee that anyone even knew they were in trouble. The silence from the cave entrance continued for over an hour, and the team began to hope that Bear 447 had finally given up her pursuit and moved on to other activities. Marcus volunteered to reconnoiter the entrance area, moving carefully through the cave system to a position where he could observe the opening without exposing himself to attack. What he found when he reached the entrance was deeply disturbing. Bear 447 had not given up. She had simply changed tactics. The massive grizzly had positioned herself in a location where she could watch the cave entrance while remaining partially concealed from observation. She was waiting with the kind of patient determination that suggested she understood that the humans would eventually have to emerge from their shelter. "She's still out there," Marcus reported when he returned to the group. "And she's not just hanging around randomly. She's set up an ambush position where she can monitor our exit while staying hidden from view. This level of tactical thinking, I've never seen anything like it in 30 years of dealing with predators." The implications of this behavior were chilling. Bear 447 was demonstrating cognitive abilities that went far beyond anything documented in grizzly bear research. She was planning ahead, modifying her behavior based on changed circumstances, and displaying a level of patience and strategic thinking that suggested intelligence approaching human-level problem-solving abilities. "We're dealing with something unprecedented here," Dr. Reeves observed, reviewing her notes on the bear's behavior throughout their encounter. "The territorial caching, the lack of defensive warning behaviors, the pursuit climbing, and now tactical ambush positioning. This animal is operating at a cognitive level that challenges everything we understand about ursine intelligence." As night began to fall outside the cave, the team faced a difficult decision. They could remain in the cave and hope that Bear 447 would eventually lose interest and move on, but they had limited food and water supplies, and the cold mountain temperatures would make an extended stay increasingly dangerous. Alternatively, they could attempt to exit the cave under cover of darkness and try to evade the bear through stealth and night movement. "Grizzlies have excellent night vision and an incredible sense of smell," Marcus warned as they debated their options. "Moving at night might give us some concealment advantage, but it also eliminates most of our ability to detect and avoid her if she's still in the area." Dr. Ashford was growing increasingly concerned about their long-term situation. Even if they managed to evade Bear 447 and begin their journey back to civilization, they faced a multi-day trek through wilderness terrain without adequate supplies for an extended survival situation. His age and physical condition made him a potential liability in a group that needed to move fast and cover difficult terrain. "I think we need to consider splitting up," he said reluctantly. "I'm slowing everyone down, and if something happens to me, It compromises the survival chances of the entire group. Sarah and the younger members should attempt to make it back to the trailhead, while Marcus and I create a diversion or find another way out. The suggestion was met with immediate resistance from the rest of the team. No one was willing to abandon a colleague, especially not the senior researcher whose knowledge and experience had been invaluable throughout their careers. But the harsh mathematics of survival in hostile wilderness terrain made his argument difficult to refute. "We're not leaving anyone behind," Sarah stated firmly. "We got into this situation as a team, and we're going to get out of it as a team. There has to be another option that doesn't involve sacrificing anyone." Jennifer had been reviewing the footage she had captured throughout their ordeal, and something in Bear 447's behavior patterns had caught her attention. "Look at this," she said, playing back portions of the video on her camera's LCD screen. "Watch the way she moves when she's investigating the cache site versus when she's pursuing us. There's a difference in her body language that might be significant. The video showed subtle but distinct changes in the bear's posture and movement patterns during different phases of their encounter. When she was at the cache site, her behavior exhibited the kind of focused intensity associated with food protection. But during the pursuit phase, her body language suggested something closer to hunting behavior, not defensive, but actively predatory. She's not just defending territory, Dr. Reeves realized as she studied the footage. She's hunting us. That's why none of the normal bear encounter protocols have been effective. We're not dealing with a defensive animal protecting resources. We're dealing with a predator that has identified humans as prey. This revelation fundamentally changed their understanding of their situation and their potential strategies for survival. Traditional bear encounter protocols were designed for defensive situations, where the goal was to convince the bear that humans were not a threat to its safety or resources. But if Bear 447 was exhibiting predatory behavior, those protocols were not only ineffective, they could actually increase the danger by presenting the team as vulnerable prey rather than potential threats. Predatory behavior in grizzly bears toward humans is extremely rare, Dr. Ashford observed, his voice troubled, as he processed the implications of their analysis. There have been only a handful of documented cases in the past century, and those typically involve bears that were either injured, starving, or had been conditioned through human contact. Bear 447 doesn't fit any of those profiles. The team spent several hours analyzing their situation and developing a modified survival strategy based on their new understanding of Bear 447's behavioral patterns. If she was indeed exhibiting predatory rather than defensive behavior, their best chance of survival lay in making themselves appear to be formidable opponents rather than easy prey. "We need to change our entire approach," Marcus concluded after reviewing their options. "Instead of trying to avoid confrontation, we need to be prepared for it. And instead of trying to appear non-threatening, we need to convince her that we're dangerous enough to leave alone." And the plan they developed involved leaving the cave as a group during the pre-dawn hours, when visibility was limited, but not completely absent. They would move in tight formation, making noise and using their equipment to appear as large and threatening as possible. If Bear 447 attacked, they would respond with every deterrent at their disposal: bear spray, noisemakers, and aggressive defensive behavior designed to inflict enough damage to discourage further pursuit. "Remember," Sarah advised as they prepared for their departure, "we're not trying to kill or seriously injure her. We just need to convince her that we're not worth the effort and risk involved in continued predation attempts. Make yourselves look dangerous, make noise, and be prepared to use everything we have if she forces a confrontation." The team emerged from the cave in the grey light of dawn, moving in the tight defensive formation they had rehearsed during the night. Every member carried multiple canisters of bear spray, emergency noisemakers, and improvised weapons constructed from their hiking equipment. They moved slowly and deliberately, constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of Bear 447's presence. The forest around them was unnaturally quiet, with none of the typical sounds of dawn wildlife activity that should have been present in healthy habitat. This silence suggested that Bear 447 was indeed still in the area, and that her presence was suppressing normal animal behavior throughout the local ecosystem. "She's watching us," Marcus said quietly, his experienced eye detecting subtle signs of observation that the others might have missed. "I can't see her, but every instinct I have is telling me she's evaluating our movements from concealment." The team continued their careful descent from the cave area, following a route that would take them back toward Kettle Creek and eventually to the main trail system. But their progress was slow and exhausting, as they had to maintain constant vigilance while navigating difficult terrain with heavy equipment loads. 2 hours into their journey, Bear 447 made her presence known. Instead of the direct attack they had been expecting, she began shadowing their movement from a distance, occasionally breaking cover to let them know she was still tracking them. This behavior was psychologically devastating. The constant awareness of being hunted by a superior predator created a level of stress and exhaustion that was difficult to sustain over the long distances they needed to travel. "She's wearing us down," Dr. Reeves observed, as they paused for a brief rest in a defensive position among some large boulders. "This is sophisticated predatory behavior. Exhaust the prey through persistent pursuit, then attack when they're too tired to mount effective resistance." Tommy was beginning to show signs of severe psychological stress, jumping at every sound and constantly looking over his shoulder for signs of the pursuing bear. His academic training had not prepared him for the reality of being hunted by a large predator, and the sustained fear was beginning to affect his judgment and physical performance. "I can't do this," he said, his voice shaking with exhaustion and terror. "She's going to kill us all, and there's nothing we can do to stop her. We should just find a place to make a stand and get it over with." Dr. Ashford moved to reassure the younger researcher, drawing on decades of experience dealing with dangerous situations in remote locations. "Panic is the enemy," he said firmly but kindly. "We've survived this long because we've stayed calm and made rational decisions. She's following us because she thinks we're easy prey, but we're not. We're intelligent, well-equipped, and we know what we're dealing with." The team resumed their trek, but their formation was becoming increasingly ragged as exhaustion and stress took their toll. Bear 447 seemed to sense their weakening condition, and her shadowing behavior became more aggressive and obvious. She was no longer content to track them from a distance. She wanted them to know she was there, wanted them to feel the constant pressure of imminent attack. "There's something else we need to consider," Jennifer said, as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of the route. "Where are her cubs? We haven't seen any sign of them since this whole thing started, and that's not normal behavior for a sow with yearlings." The question of the missing cubs had been nagging at all of them, but the immediate demands of survival had pushed it to the background of their concerns. A grizzly sow's primary behavioral motivation was the protection and care of her offspring, and the absence of cubs would explain many of the unusual behaviors they had observed. "If something happened to her cubs," Dr. Reeves suggested grimly, "it could have triggered a complete behavioral breakdown. Grizzly sows that lose their offspring sometimes exhibit aberrant behaviors that can include increased aggression, territorial expansion, and even cannibalistic tendencies." The possibility that Bear 447's unusual behavior was the result of maternal trauma added another layer of complexity to their survival situation. A bear that was operating from a position of psychological damage rather than rational predatory instinct would be even more unpredictable and dangerous than they had already observed. As the day progressed, the team's physical and psychological condition continued to deteriorate. They had been operating on pure adrenaline and survival instinct for over 18 hours, and the sustained stress was beginning to affect their decision-making abilities. Several team members were showing signs of dehydration and exhaustion, and their pace was slowing to the point where Bear 447 was gaining ground on them. "We need to make a stand," Marcus finally announced as they reached a position that offered some tactical advantages, a rocky outcrop with limited approach routes and good visibility in multiple directions. "We can't outrun her, and we're too tired to maintain effective defensive formation much longer. This is as good a place as any to determine whether our deterrent strategies are going to work." The team established a defensive perimeter using their equipment and natural terrain features, with each member positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire for their bear spray canisters. They had approximately a dozen canisters between them, plus various noisemakers and improvised weapons. If Bear 447 was determined to attack, they would give her a fight that would hopefully convince her to seek easier prey elsewhere. Bear 447 approached their defensive position with the same methodical determination she had shown throughout their ordeal. But instead of the straightforward attack they were expecting, she began circling their perimeter at a distance, testing their responses and looking for weaknesses in their formation. This tactical probing behavior was more evidence of intelligence that went far beyond normal ursine capabilities. "She's learning," Sarah observed, with a mixture of professional fascination and personal terror. "She's evaluating our defensive capabilities and modifying her approach accordingly. This is tool use and tactical planning at a level that challenges everything we know about animal cognition." The standoff continued for over an hour, with Bear 447 gradually tightening her circle around their position, while the research team maintained their defensive formation and prepared for what seemed like inevitable contact. The psychological pressure of being hunted by an intelligent predator was unlike anything any of them had experienced, even those with extensive backgrounds in dangerous wildlife encounters. When the attack finally came, it was from an unexpected direction, and with a speed that caught everyone off guard. Bear 447 had used the terrain and vegetation to approach their position from a blind spot, and her initial charge brought her within the defensive perimeter before anyone could react with bear spray or other deterrents. Dr. Ashford found himself directly in the path of the charging bear, and his response was both instinctive and heroic. Instead of attempting to flee or defend himself, he positioned his body between Bear 447 and the younger members of the team, deploying his bear spray at point-blank range while shouting for the others to use the distraction to escape. The bear spray had maximum effect at such close range, and Bear 447's charge faltered as the chemical deterrent temporarily blinded her and caused severe respiratory distress. But instead of retreating, she lashed out blindly in the direction where she had last seen her human adversaries, and her massive claws caught Dr. Ashford across the chest and shoulder. The impact of a 500-pound grizzly bear's claws striking a human body was devastating and immediate. Dr. Ashford was thrown backward against the rocks, with injuries that were obviously severe, but he remained conscious and continued shouting instructions to his team, even as his own situation became increasingly desperate. "Get out of here," he commanded, his voice weakened by shock and blood loss, but still carrying the authority that had guided research teams for decades. "Follow the creek downstream, stay together, and don't stop moving until you reach help. Document everything that happened here. The scientific community needs to know about this behavioral anomaly." Marcus was already moving to assist the injured researcher, but Bear 447 was recovering from the effects of the bear spray more quickly than anyone had anticipated. Her vision was returning, and her rage at being chemically attacked was evident in every aspect of her body language as she prepared for another assault. "Go! Go! Go!" Marcus shouted, deploying his own bear spray to create a chemical barrier between the bear and the rest of the team. "I'll stay with Doc and provide cover. You need to get to help and organize a rescue operation." The remaining team members, Sarah, Tommy, Jennifer, and Dr. Reeves, made the agonizing decision to follow Marcus's orders and abandon their colleagues in order to seek help. It went against every instinct they had as both researchers and human beings, but the mathematics of survival made it the only rational choice available. As they fled the scene of the attack, the sounds of continued confrontation echoed through the forest behind them. Bear spray deployments, human voices, and the enraged vocalizations of Bear 447 created a cacophony of violence that would haunt their memories for years to come. But they forced themselves to continue moving, knowing that their only chance of helping their colleagues was to reach civilization and organize a professional rescue operation. The 4 survivors made better time without the need to assist Dr. Ashford, but they were still exhausted, traumatized, and operating in hostile territory with a dangerous predator somewhere behind them. Their route followed Kettle Creek downstream, navigating through dense timber and rocky terrain that made rapid movement difficult and dangerous. "We need to establish communication as soon as we get within range of a cell tower or radio repeater," Sarah said, as they paused to rest and assess their situation. "The rescue teams are going to need exact coordinates, detailed information about Bear 447's behavior, and medical information about Dr. Ashford's injuries." Tommy was struggling to process what they had witnessed, his academic understanding of wildlife behavior completely overwhelmed by the reality of intelligent predation by a grizzly bear. "How do we explain this?" he asked. "Who's going to believe that a bear was exhibiting tactical hunting behavior and problem-solving abilities that rival human intelligence?" "We have the video footage," Jennifer reminded them, checking her equipment to ensure that the documentation of their encounter was intact. "And we have multiple trained observers who witnessed the same behaviors. The scientific community will have to accept the evidence, even if it challenges established theories about ursine cognition." Dr. Reeves was concerned about the broader implications of their discovery. If Bear 447's behavior represented a new evolutionary development in grizzly bear intelligence, it could have significant impacts on wildlife management policies and human safety protocols throughout bear habitat regions. But their immediate priority had to be the rescue of their colleagues and their own survival. The team continued downstream for another 6 hours before they finally detected a faint radio signal that indicated they were approaching the edge of the wilderness area. Tommy managed to establish brief contact with a Forest Service station, providing their approximate location and requesting immediate assistance for a wildlife attack with serious injuries. The rescue operation that followed was one of the largest wilderness medical evacuations in the region's history. Multiple agencies responded, including search and rescue teams, wildlife management personnel, and medical helicopter crews. The coordination effort was complicated by the need to operate in an area with a known dangerous animal, requiring armed escorts and specialized equipment. Marcus and Dr. Ashford were located approximately 8 hours after the initial rescue request was received. Marcus had managed to keep Bear 447 at bay through strategic use of remaining bear spray and defensive positioning, but Dr. Ashford's condition was critical due to blood loss and shock. The helicopter evacuation was performed under armed guard, with wildlife officers maintaining overwatch for any sign of Bear 447's presence. Dr. Ashford survived his injuries, but required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation to recover from the trauma inflicted by Bear 447's attack. His injuries included deep lacerations across his chest and shoulder, broken ribs, and severe soft tissue damage that would leave permanent scars and reduced mobility. But he was alive, and his experience provided crucial first-hand information about close contact interaction with an aberrantly intelligent grizzly bear. The search for Bear 447 became an intensive multi-agency operation involving wildlife biologists, experienced trackers, and specialized equipment, including helicopter-based tranquilizer operations. But the bear seemed to have vanished from her established territory, leaving behind only the cache site and various pieces of physical evidence that documented her unusual behavioral patterns. "It's like she understood that her activities had attracted attention," the lead wildlife officer reported after a week of intensive search operations. "The abandonment of established territory, the lack of any detectable sign, the complete disappearance. This suggests cognitive abilities that we're not equipped to deal with using standard wildlife management protocols." The investigation into Bear 447's behavior revealed additional disturbing information. Analysis of the cache site showed evidence that she had been storing and feeding on a variety of animal species, including some that were not typical grizzly prey. More disturbing were indications that she had been experimenting with different preservation techniques, suggesting not just intelligence but also a capacity for innovation and learning. "We're looking at behavior that goes beyond anything documented in ursine research," Dr. Reeves explained to the joint agency briefing that was organized to address the Bear 447 situation. Tool use, tactical planning, innovative problem-solving, and now evidence of experimental behavior. This animal represents a quantum leap in grizzly bear cognition. The mystery of Bear 447's missing cubs was solved when searchers discovered their remains in a secondary cache site approximately 2 miles from the main site. The cubs appeared to have been killed by another bear, possibly a large boar, and their mother's subsequent behavioral breakdown had triggered the aberrant patterns that had made her so dangerous to human observers. Maternal trauma in grizzly bears can cause significant behavioral changes, Dr. Ashford explained during his recovery, speaking from his hospital bed to the assembled researchers and wildlife managers. But what we observed went far beyond simple grief response. Bear 447 was exhibiting cognitive abilities that suggest either a rare genetic mutation or some kind of environmental factor that enhanced her intellectual development. The footage that Jennifer had captured during their ordeal became the subject of intense analysis by wildlife behaviorists, cognitive scientists, and even researchers studying artificial intelligence. The video provided unprecedented documentation of complex problem-solving behavior in a wild animal and challenged fundamental assumptions about the cognitive capabilities of non-human species. "This changes everything," one prominent animal cognition researcher commented after reviewing the footage. "We're looking at evidence of abstract reasoning, tactical planning, and innovative behavior that we previously thought was limited to primates and a few other highly intelligent species." This bear was thinking several steps ahead and modifying her behavior based on predicted human responses. The long-term impact of the Bear 447 incident extended far beyond the immediate trauma experienced by the research team. Wildlife management protocols throughout North America were revised to account for the possibility of aberrantly intelligent predators, and research programs were established to investigate whether Bear 447 represented an isolated case or the beginning of a broader evolutionary trend. Sarah returned to her research, but with a fundamentally changed understanding of the animals she studied. The experience of being hunted by an intelligent predator had given her insights into prey behavior that no amount of academic study could have provided, and her subsequent research focused on the cognitive capabilities of large predators and their implications for human-wildlife interactions. "We went into that forest thinking we were the intelligent observers studying primitive subjects," she reflected years later. "But Bear 447 taught us that we might be the ones being studied, and that the natural world contains intelligences that we're only beginning to understand." Tommy left wildlife research entirely, unable to reconcile his academic understanding of animal behavior with the reality of what he had experienced in the wilderness. He eventually became a high school biology teacher, but never spoke publicly about his encounter with Bear 447 and avoided wilderness areas for the rest of his life. Jennifer's footage became part of a documentary about animal intelligence that won multiple awards and sparked public interest in cognitive research involving large predators. But she, like the others, was forever changed by the experience of being prey to an intelligence that challenged human assumptions about their place in the natural order. Marcus continued guiding, but with a new appreciation for the unpredictability of wilderness encounters and a heightened awareness of behavioral indicators that might suggest aberrant animal intelligence. His experience with Bear 447 made him one of the most sought-after guides in bear country, as clients trusted his ability to recognize and respond to dangerous situations before they became life-threatening. Bear 447 was never seen again, despite extensive search efforts and ongoing monitoring of the region where she had been active. Whether she moved to a different territory, died from unknown causes, or simply became more effective at avoiding human detection remained a mystery. But her brief period of documented activity had provided enough scientific data to revolutionize understanding of ursine cognition and establish new protocols for human safety in bear habitat. The cache site at Kettle Creek was eventually cleared and the area returned to normal wildlife activity, but it remained a focal point for researchers studying innovative behavior in wild animals. The site became something of a pilgrimage destination for wildlife biologists, a place where the boundaries between human and animal intelligence had been challenged in ways that were still being understood and debated years later. Dr. Reeves published the definitive scientific paper on the Bear 447 incident, documenting every aspect of the encounter and its implications for wildlife management and cognitive research. The paper became one of the most cited works in animal behavior literature and established new research protocols for studying intelligence in large predators. What we learned from Bear 447, Dr. Reeves wrote in her conclusion, is that the natural world contains cognitive capabilities that we're only beginning to recognize and understand. The traditional view of humans as uniquely intelligent observers of primitive animal subjects is no longer tenable. We share this world with intelligences that may rival or exceed our own in ways we're still discovering. The survivors of the Bear 447 encounter remained connected by their shared experience, meeting annually to discuss their ongoing research and to remember Dr. Ashford's courage in protecting his team during their darkest moment. They had been forever changed by their encounter with an intelligence that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Northern Rockies, the legacy of Bear 447 lived on in the enhanced awareness of researchers, the revised protocols of wildlife managers, and the haunting knowledge that humanity might not be alone in possessing the kind of intelligence that could plan, innovate, and adapt to changing circumstances with deadly effectiveness. The howling of wolves across Kettle Creek still echoed through the forest at night, but now those sounds carried a different meaning for anyone who understood what had happened in that remote drainage during one terrifying September when the natural order of predator and prey had been challenged by an intelligence that defied all established scientific understanding. The next stories. When the Wild Calls. The morning of September 1st, 2024, dawned crisp and clear over Homer, Alaska, with the kind of crystalline air that made every breath feel like a blessing. Reverend Charles Boyd stood at the window of the small St. Nicholas Orthodox Church, watching the sun paint the Kenai Peninsula in shades of gold and amber. At 62, Charles had spent the last 15 years serving this remote congregation, and he never tired of the raw beauty that surrounded their little community. The church itself was a modest structure, built in 1967 by a group of Russian Orthodox families who had settled in the area. Its distinctive onion dome and weathered cedar siding had become a landmark for both locals and the occasional tourist who ventured this far from the main Homer attractions. The building sat on a gentle rise overlooking Kachemak Bay, with dense spruce and alder forest pressing close on three sides. Charles adjusted his vestments and reviewed his sermon notes one final time. Today's service would focus on the theme of stewardship, humanity's responsibility to care for God's creation. It seemed particularly fitting, given their location in one of Alaska's most pristine wilderness areas. He had chosen passages from Genesis and Psalms that spoke to the interconnectedness of all living things. Margaret Thornton arrived first, as she had every Sunday for the past 12 years. At 74, she was the unofficial matriarch of their small congregation, a woman whose weathered hands had gutted thousands of salmon and whose steady faith had anchored many through Alaska's harsh winters. She carried a thermos of coffee and a plate of her famous blueberry scones, still warm from the oven. "Morning, Father Boyd," she called, using the familiar title even though Charles preferred the less formal Pastor Charlie. Margaret set her offerings on the small table near the entrance and began arranging the hymnals that had been scattered by last week's visiting children. "Beautiful morning, Margaret," Charles replied, genuinely pleased to see her. "How's your grandson doing up in Fairbanks?" Margaret's face brightened as she launched into an update about Tommy's progress at the University of Alaska. Her voice carried the particular warmth that grandmothers reserve for discussing their grandchildren's achievements, no matter how minor they might seem to others. The Kowalski family arrived next in their battered pickup truck, the engine making the distinctive knocking sound that had been just about to be fixed for the past 6 months. David Kowalski, a 45-year-old commercial fisherman, climbed out first, followed by his wife Elena and their 3 children. Sarah, 16 and perpetually embarrassed by everything her parents did. Michael, 14 and more interested in his phone than his surroundings. And little Emma, 8 years old and bubbling with the kind of energy that made sitting still for an hour-long service a heroic feat. Elena Kowalski taught 3rd grade at the Homer Elementary School and possessed the particular patience that came from managing 28 children day after day. She helped Emma out of her car seat while simultaneously reminding Sarah to grab the flowers they had brought for the altar and telling Michael to put his phone away until after the service. "The Hendersons coming today?" David asked Charles, referring to the family that had recently moved to the area from Minnesota. "I believe so," Charles replied. "Jim mentioned they were looking forward to it when I saw him at the hardware store on Thursday." The Henderson family had purchased a small cabin about 5 miles up the Anchor River Road, hoping to start fresh after Jim lost his job with a Minneapolis engineering firm. Jim Henderson, 53, had used his severance package and their savings to make the move, convinced that Alaska would offer opportunities for a man willing to work with his hands. His wife, Carol, 48, had been less enthusiastic about leaving behind their suburban comfort, but she supported her husband's dream of self-sufficiency. Their daughter Amy, 21, had reluctantly agreed to defer her final year of college to help the family establish themselves. By 9:15, the small congregation had assembled. In addition to the regulars, there were a few faces Charles didn't immediately recognize. Tourists or newcomers drawn by curiosity or genuine spiritual seeking. The total count was 18 people, which represented a good turnout for their little church. Old Pete Nakamura sat in his usual spot in the third row, his 90-year-old frame still ramrod straight, despite decades of commercial fishing in some of the world's most dangerous waters. Next to him sat his daughter Susan, a 42-year-old nurse at South Peninsula Hospital who had never married but who lavished her considerable capacity for caring on her patients and her aging father. The Volkov brothers, Dmitry and Pavel, occupied the back row as always. These two Russian immigrants had arrived in Homer in 1994, part of the wave of Eastern Europeans who came seeking opportunity in Alaska's fishing industry. They owned a small boat repair business and were known for their skill with marine engines and their legendary consumption of vodka, though never before Sunday services. Charles began the service with the traditional Orthodox greeting, his voice carrying easily through the small space. The morning light streamed through the few stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the wooden floor. Everything felt peaceful and right with the world. He was 20 minutes into his sermon, speaking about humanity's role as caretakers of creation, when Sarah Kowalski noticed movement in the trees behind the church. At first, she dismissed it as wind stirring the branches, but something about the motion seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. She found herself watching the forest edge instead of listening to Pastor Boyd's words about stewardship and responsibility. The movement stopped, then resumed closer to the building. Sarah's teenage experience of being perpetually bored was temporarily suspended by a growing sense that something was not quite right. She glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the adults were all focused on Charles's sermon, and her younger brothers were engaged in their usual battle against restlessness. In the forest, a massive Kodiak brown bear had caught the scent of something unusual. At 10 years old and weighing nearly 800 pounds, this particular bear represented the apex of North American predators. He had spent the summer months feeding heavily on salmon in the streams that fed into Kachemak Bay, building up the fat reserves that would carry him through winter hibernation. But September was a critical time, the final push to accumulate calories before the long sleep. The bear's name, if he could be said to have one, might have been Scarface, for the distinctive marks across his massive head that spoke of territorial battles fought and won over the years. He had established dominance over a territory that stretched from the coastal flats to the alpine meadows above the tree line, an area encompassing roughly 40 square miles of prime bear habitat. This morning, Scarface had been following a game trail that led him closer to human habitation than he typically preferred. The scent that had caught his attention was complex, a mixture of human activity, food smells, and something else that triggered deep-seated behavioral patterns developed over thousands of years of evolution. Kodiak brown bears are generally shy around humans, despite their fearsome reputation. Most encounters end with the bear retreating into the forest, often before the human even realizes they were being observed. But several factors were combining to create a potentially dangerous situation. The bear was in the crucial pre-hibernation feeding period when every calorie mattered. The previous week had seen unusually warm weather that had caused many of the berry bushes to ripen later than normal, disrupting the bear's typical feeding patterns. And perhaps most significantly, this particular bear had recently had an encounter with a human that had left him with a minor injury, a cut on his front paw from stepping on a piece of discarded camping equipment. The injury wasn't serious, but it had created an association between human scent and discomfort. Animal behaviorists call this negative conditioning, and it can sometimes lead to aggressive responses in situations where a bear might normally retreat. Charles was discussing the biblical concept of dominion versus domination when the first real sign of trouble appeared. Emma Kowalski, whose 8-year-old attention span had been stretched to its limit, was amusing herself by making faces at the decorative icons on the walls when she saw a massive brown shape moving past one of the side windows. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging on Elena's sleeve, "there's a really big dog outside." Elena automatically shushed her daughter without looking, assuming it was just another attempt to create a distraction. Emma frowned and looked back at the window, but the shape was gone. Outside, Scarface had approached the church building with the careful deliberation that characterized all his movements. Bears are remarkably intelligent animals, capable of complex problem-solving and long-term planning. They're also incredibly curious, particularly about anything that might represent a food source. The smells coming from the building were intriguing. Human scent, yes, but also something sweeter. Margaret's blueberry scones, though safely inside, were nonetheless broadcasting their presence to one of the most sophisticated noses in the animal kingdom. The bear circled the building slowly, testing the air and examining this unusual structure that had appeared in his territory. The building's construction was solid, thick cedar logs chinked with modern materials, but like many older structures in Alaska, it had been built more for weather protection than wildlife exclusion. Charles was reaching the climax of his sermon, his voice rising with conviction as he spoke about humanity's sacred duty to protect and preserve the natural world, when the sound came from outside. It started as a low rumbling, almost subsonic, the kind of sound you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The congregation began to shift uneasily. Pete Nakamura, whose decades on the water had taught him to pay attention to subtle changes in his environment, was the first to turn toward the sound. His weathered face took on a look of concern as he tried to identify what he was hearing. The sound came again, closer now, and more clearly identifiable as something alive and very large. David Kowalski had guided fishing parties into bear country enough times to recognize the sound, and his face went pale as the implications hit him. "Everyone stay very still," he said quietly, his voice cutting through Charles's sermon. "We may have a bear outside." The effect on the congregation was immediate. Those with Alaska experience knew exactly what this might mean, while the newer residents and visitors felt their stomachs drop as they processed the potential danger. Charles stopped speaking mid-sentence, his own experience with wildlife kicking in as he assessed the situation. Elena Kowalski immediately pulled Emma close to her side while gesturing for Michael to move nearer. Sarah, her teenage bravado temporarily forgotten, pressed closer to her family. The Henderson family, still adjusting to life in Alaska, looked around uncertainly, not sure whether this was a common occurrence or a genuine emergency. The scratching sound began then, deliberate, testing scratches against the wooden walls of the church. Scarface was investigating the building's construction, using his claws to test the strength of the materials. His investigation was methodical, moving from the foundation up toward the windows. Susan Nakamura, her medical training helping her stay calm under pressure, quietly moved toward her father while keeping her voice low. "Dad, should we call Fish and Game?" she whispered. Pete shook his head slightly. "No cell service up here," he replied in barely audible tones, "and might not be necessary. Could just be curious. They usually move on." But even as he said it, Pete's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Something about the deliberate nature of the sounds outside suggested this wasn't a typical encounter. Bears investigating human structures usually did so quickly and moved on when they detected the presence of people. This one seemed to be taking his time. The scratching stopped, replaced by a different sound, a low huffing that indicated the bear was testing scents more actively. Margaret Thornton found herself thinking about the plate of scones she had brought, wondering if the smell might be what had attracted the animal. She had lived in Alaska long enough to know that bears could detect food odors from remarkable distances, but she had never considered that her baking might present a danger. Charles was mentally reviewing everything he knew about bear encounters. Stay calm, don't make sudden movements, don't run unless you have a clear escape route, make noise to let the bear know you're human. But all of that advice assumed you were outdoors, where you could back away slowly. Trapped inside a building changed the dynamics considerably. The sound of splintering wood made everyone freeze. It came from the back of the church, near the small room where Charles prepared for services and stored supplies. Scarface had found a section where the chinking between logs was less secure, and his powerful claws were making quick work of the material. "Is there another way out?" Jim Henderson asked quietly, his engineering background making him focus on escape routes and structural integrity. Charles nodded toward the main entrance. "Front door, and there's a small window in the back room, but it's pretty high up." The splintering sound continued, accompanied now by low vocalizations that suggested the bear was becoming frustrated. Kodiak bears are not generally aggressive animals, but they are incredibly powerful, and when they encounter obstacles to something they want, they have the tools to remove those obstacles. Amy Henderson pulled out her phone and checked for signal strength. Like most young people, her first instinct in an emergency was to call for help, but Pete had been right. Cell service this far from town was spotty at best. Her phone showed no bars. The sound stopped abruptly, creating a silence that felt more ominous than the noise had. Everyone in the church remained motionless, straining to hear any indication of what the bear was doing. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute before being broken by a new sound, heavy footsteps moving around the building. Scarface had given up on the back wall and was conducting a more systematic investigation of the entire structure. His behavior was entering a more determined phase, suggesting that whatever had attracted him wasn't just casual curiosity. The combination of food odors and the unusual situation of finding humans enclosed in a wooden structure was triggering responses that didn't follow the typical patterns of bear-human encounters. Elena Kowalski was fighting her instinct to gather her children and run. Her rational mind understood that sudden movement might precipitate the very confrontation they were trying to avoid, but her maternal instincts were screaming at her to get her family to safety. Emma was pressed against her side, no longer restless or bored, while Michael had gone pale and still in a way that reminded Elena of how young 14 really was. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the main entrance. Through the small windows flanking the door, several people caught glimpses of brown fur and realized just how massive the animal outside truly was. Kodiak bears are the largest subspecies of brown bear, and adult males can stand 4 feet tall at the shoulder while on all fours. When they rear up on their hind legs, as this one was doing now, they can reach heights of 9 or 10 feet. The testing of the door began with a gentle push, as if the bear was checking to see if this barrier would yield as easily as the chinking had. The door, fortunately, was solid and well built, but everyone could see it flex slightly under the pressure. Charles found himself calculating whether the hinges and lock would hold if the bear decided to apply his full strength. "Should we make noise?" Carol Henderson whispered. "Try to scare it away." David Kowalski shook his head. "Not when we can't retreat. If we startle him and he decides to charge, we're trapped." The bear's investigation of the door became more aggressive. The wood groaned under increasing pressure, and everyone could hear the sound of claws scraping against the exterior surface. Scarface was problem-solving, testing the strength of this obstacle that stood between him and whatever had attracted his attention. It was then that Emma Kowalski made the decision that would change everything. Despite her mother's restraining arm, the 8-year-old suddenly darted toward the front window, driven by the kind of childish curiosity that overrides adult cautions. She wanted to see the bear, to get a better look at the massive animal that had everyone so frightened. Her movement was sudden and unexpected, causing her chair to scrape loudly against the wooden floor. The sound carried clearly through the thin walls of the church, and the effect on the bear was immediate. The testing of the door stopped, replaced by a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the building's frame. "Emma, no!" Elena's voice came out louder than she had intended, her maternal panic overriding her attempt to stay quiet. The sound of human voices seemed to galvanize the bear into action. What happened next occurred with startling speed. The front door, which had been groaning under pressure, suddenly exploded inward as 800 pounds of muscle and determination hit it with full force. The solid wood splintered like kindling, sending fragments flying across the church's interior. Scarface burst through the destroyed entrance in a display of raw power that left everyone stunned. The bear paused for a moment in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space completely, his small dark eyes scanning the interior as he processed this new environment and the humans within it. The congregation's reaction was immediate and varied. Several people screamed, the sound sharp and piercing in the enclosed space. Pete Nakamura, despite his age, immediately positioned himself between the bear and his daughter. The Volkov brothers, their fishing boat reflexes still sharp, began backing toward the side wall while looking for anything that might serve as a weapon. Charles, his pastoral instincts overriding his fear, stepped forward slightly, not in aggression, but in an attempt to place himself between the bear and his congregation. His movement was slow and deliberate, an attempt to appear non-threatening while still protecting others. "Nobody run," he said in a voice that was remarkably steady given the circumstances. "Move slowly toward the back of the church." But the situation was already beyond the point where calm retreat might work. The bear's presence inside the enclosed space had created a dynamic unlike any typical bear encounter. Scarface was now experiencing the same trapped feeling that the humans were, and his response was to become more aggressive rather than retreating. The bear advanced into the church, his massive paws making surprisingly little sound on the wooden floor. His head swayed from side to side as he tracked the movements and scents of the people around him. The food smell that had initially attracted him, Margaret's scones, was now overlaid with the sharp scent of human fear, creating a complex olfactory situation that was further complicating his behavioral responses. Sarah Kowalski, pressed against the far wall with her family, found herself thinking with the strange clarity that sometimes comes in extreme situations. She noticed details that seemed absurdly precise given the circumstances, the way the bear's fur caught the morning light streaming through the windows, the surprising intelligence in his dark eyes, the methodical way he was assessing each person in turn. The bear's attention fixed on Margaret Thornton, who had instinctively clutched her plate of scones closer to her body when the chaos began. The sweet smell of blueberries was like a beacon to the animal's sophisticated nose, and he began moving in her direction with the purposeful gait of a predator who had identified his target. Margaret, at 74, had lived through enough of life to face this moment with more resignation than panic. She understood what was happening and why. Looking around at the younger members of the congregation, the children who deserved the chance to grow up, the families who needed their parents, she made a decision that reflected a lifetime of putting others first. With movements that were deliberate despite her trembling hands, Margaret slowly set the plate of scones on the floor and backed away from it, Her hope was that the food would satisfy the bear's interest and that he would take it and leave. It was a reasonable hope based on typical bear behavior. Most encounters with food end when the bear secures the food source. Scarface approached the plate cautiously, his attention focused on this unexpected bounty. For a moment, it seemed as though Margaret's sacrifice might work. The bear lowered his massive head to investigate the scones, and everyone in the church held their breath, hoping this would end the encounter peacefully. But the situation had progressed beyond simple food motivation. The bear's entry into the enclosed space, the presence of multiple humans, and his own elevated stress levels had combined to create a more complex behavioral situation. While he was interested in the food, he was also now committed to asserting dominance in what he perceived as a territorial challenge. After briefly investigating the scones, Scarface raised his head and looked directly at Charles, who had remained standing between the bear and the congregation. To the bear, Charles's positioning and upright posture read as a challenge, another large male refusing to submit to his dominance. The charge, when it came, was devastating in its speed and power. Despite his size, Scarface moved with the fluid grace of an apex predator, covering the distance to Charles in 2 massive bounds. The pastor had time for one desperate attempt to dodge aside, but the confined space worked against him. The impact sent Charles flying backward into the wooden altar, the sound of the collision echoing through the church like a gunshot. The bear followed immediately, not with the calculated killing behavior of a hunting predator, but with the determined aggression of an animal asserting territorial dominance. What followed was not the extended mauling that popular media might suggest, but a brief, violent assertion of dominance. Scarface struck Charles twice with his massive paws, the blows powerful enough to cause severe trauma, but not delivered with the intent to kill and consume. This was dominance behavior, not predation. The entire encounter, from the moment the bear entered the church to the moment Charles fell unconscious, lasted less than 90 seconds. But those seconds contained enough violence and terror to traumatize everyone present for years to come. The congregation's response was immediate, but varied by their experience and proximity to the attack. Susan Nakamura, her medical training overriding her fear, immediately began moving toward Charles while keeping a careful eye on the bear. David Kowalski had grabbed a wooden chair and was holding it between himself and the animal, ready to defend his family if the bear turned on them. Elena Kowalski had wrapped her arms around all 3 children, trying to shield them from seeing the worst of what had happened. Emma was sobbing against her mother's shoulder, while Michael stood rigid with shock. Sarah, despite her fear, was trying to help her mother protect the younger children. The Henderson family, still processing what they had witnessed, pressed themselves against the far wall. Jim was calculating distances to the broken front door, wondering if they could make it out if the bear decided to continue his attack. Carol was fighting her own shock to stay focused on their daughter Amy, who had gone pale and appeared to be hyperventilating. Margaret Thornton, having seen her attempt at appeasement fail so catastrophically, was now focused entirely on survival. Despite her age, she was moving with surprising agility toward the back of the church, hoping to find some kind of protection behind the wooden pews. The Volkov brothers had positioned themselves near what remained of the front entrance, ready to bolt if the opportunity presented itself, but also prepared to fight if necessary. Their years of hard physical work had left them in better shape than most men their age, and they had the kind of practical courage that comes from facing dangerous situations on fishing boats. Old Pete Nakamura had done something that spoke to both his age and his experience. He had sat down in his pew and was waiting to see what would happen next. At 90, he had survived the Great Depression, World War II, and 60 years of Alaskan winters. He wasn't going to panic now. Scarface, having established his dominance over the challenge represented by Charles, now found himself in an unfamiliar situation. He was inside a human structure, surrounded by multiple humans, and his normal behavioral patterns didn't provide clear guidance for what to do next. Bears are creatures of habit and pattern, and this situation was outside his experience. For several long moments, the bear stood over Charles's motionless form, his breath visible in the cool morning air that was now flowing through the destroyed entrance. His posture suggested he was processing the situation, trying to decide whether he had achieved his goal or whether further action was necessary. Susan Nakamura made the decision that would later be credited with preventing further casualties. Despite the obvious danger, she began speaking to the bear in a low, calm voice while slowly moving toward Charles. Her medical training had taught her that Charles would die without immediate intervention, and her nurse's oath wouldn't allow her to let that happen, even in the face of mortal danger. "Easy, big guy," she said softly, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. "Nobody's challenging you. We're all just going to stay calm and quiet." The bear's attention shifted to Susan, but her non-threatening posture and calm demeanor seemed to register as submission rather than challenge. She continued talking as she moved, maintaining eye contact, but not the direct stare that bears interpret as aggression. "That's right, you're the boss here," she continued, now close enough to Charles to see the extent of his injuries. "Nobody's going to bother you. We're all just going to be very quiet and still." Charles was unconscious but breathing, though his respiration was shallow and rapid. Susan's quick assessment revealed severe trauma to his chest and abdomen, likely internal injuries, and possible head trauma from his impact with the altar. He needed immediate medical attention, but any sudden movements might provoke another attack from the bear. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was actually about 10 minutes. Scarface seemed to be losing interest in the humans now that his dominance had been established. He investigated the scattered scones more thoroughly, consuming them methodically while keeping one eye on the people around him. It was Amy Henderson who first noticed that the bear's behavior was changing. Despite her fear, her college psychology classes had included some study of animal behavior, and she could see that the bear's posture was becoming less aggressive. His ears, which had been flattened back against his head during the attack, were now in a more neutral position. His movement around the church was becoming more exploratory and less threatening. "I think he's calming down," she whispered to her parents. "Maybe if we just stay still, he'll leave on his own." Her assessment proved accurate. After consuming Margaret's scones and conducting a thorough olfactory investigation of the church interior, Scarface began moving toward the broken entrance. His departure was as sudden as his arrival had been. One moment he was investigating the altar area, and the next he was moving through the doorway and back into the forest. The silence that followed his departure was profound. For several moments, nobody moved or spoke, afraid that any sound might bring the bear back. It was Susan who finally broke the spell, her medical training overriding all other considerations. "I need help," she called out, her voice urgent but controlled. "Charles is badly hurt, and we need to get him to a hospital immediately." The congregation sprang into action with the kind of coordinated response that spoke to their shared experience of living in a place where emergency situations were not uncommon. David Kowalski immediately began organizing the evacuation, while Elena tended to the children. The Volkov brothers started moving debris from the entrance to create a clear path for carrying Charles out. Jim Henderson, his engineering background making him focus on practical problems, was already calculating the logistics of getting an injured man down the mountain road to medical care. The nearest hospital was South Peninsula Hospital in Homer, about 20 miles away over roads that could be challenging even under good conditions. Margaret Thornton, despite her own shock and the trauma of having inadvertently attracted the bear, immediately began organizing the other women to provide whatever assistance Susan might need. At 74, she had enough life experience to know that guilt was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. There would be time later for sorting out blame and responsibility. Pete Nakamura, moving with surprising agility for a 90-year-old, made his way to Charles's side. "How bad is it, Susan?" he asked quietly. Susan's assessment was grim but not hopeless. "Possible internal bleeding, definitely some broken ribs, and I'm concerned about head trauma. We need to immobilize his spine and get him to emergency surgery as quickly as possible." The improvised stretcher was created from wooden planks, taken from the damaged altar and Elena's jacket. Moving Charles required careful coordination to avoid exacerbating his spinal injuries, but Susan's medical expertise guided the process. Within 15 minutes of the bear's departure, they had him secured and ready for transport. The journey to the hospital became an exercise in community cooperation. David Kowalski drove his pickup truck with Susan and Charles in the back, while Jim Henderson followed in his vehicle with several other congregation members. The remaining people stayed at the church to deal with the immediate aftermath and to provide information to the authorities who would inevitably arrive. The 20-mile journey to South Peninsula Hospital took nearly 40 minutes over roads that seemed designed to test the limits of vehicle suspension systems. Susan spent the entire trip monitoring Charles's vital signs and trying to keep him stable, while David pushed his aging truck as hard as he dared without risking a breakdown that would delay their arrival even further. Dr. Sarah Chen was the emergency room physician on duty when they arrived, and her quick assessment confirmed Susan's diagnosis. Charles was rushed into surgery for internal bleeding and to address several broken ribs that had punctured his lung. The head trauma, while serious, appeared to be less life-threatening than initially feared. The hospital waiting room became an impromptu gathering place for the congregation and the extended Homer community. News of the bear attack had spread quickly through the small town's communication networks, and people began arriving to offer support, assistance, and to simply witness the aftermath of an event that would become part of local legend. Elena Kowalski had brought all 3 children to the hospital, partly because she didn't want to let them out of her sight, and partly because she knew they needed to process what they had experienced. Emma was clinging to her mother with the desperate intensity of a child who had seen the adult world's promise of safety shattered. Michael was displaying the kind of false bravado that teenage boys use to mask their fear, while Sarah seemed to be processing the event with a maturity that surprised even her parents. The Henderson family was dealing with their own reaction to having witnessed something that challenged their decision to move to Alaska. Carol Henderson was quietly questioning whether they had made a terrible mistake in bringing their family to a place where such dangers were possible. Jim was having the opposite reaction. The experience had somehow confirmed his belief that they belonged in a place where life was more immediate and authentic than suburban Minneapolis had ever been. Amy Henderson was dealing with her own complex emotions about the morning's events. The attack had been terrifying, but she had also been struck by the community's response, the immediate cooperation, the willingness of people to risk their own safety for others, and the way everyone had simply assumed responsibility for dealing with the crisis. It was unlike anything she had experienced in her college environment. Margaret Thornton was struggling with guilt over her role in attracting the bear, despite everyone's assurance that she couldn't have known what would happen. At 74, she had developed the wisdom to know that life often involved unintended consequences, but that intellectual understanding didn't ease her emotional burden. The Volkov brothers had taken on the responsibility of securing the damaged church and dealing with the immediate practical issues. They had contacted a friend who did construction work to temporarily board up the broken entrance and had called the church's insurance company to begin the claims process. Their practical approach to crisis management reflected their immigrant experience of dealing with situations where official help might not be immediately available. Pete Nakamura had positioned himself as the unofficial spokesman for the group, his age and experience giving him natural authority in dealing with the hospital staff, the media representatives who were already beginning to arrive, and the officials from Alaska Fish and Game who would need to investigate the incident. The investigation began within hours of Charles's arrival at the hospital. Wildlife biologist Dr. Jennifer Martinez had been called in to assess the situation and determine what factors had contributed to the attack. Her preliminary interviews with the witnesses revealed a complex situation that didn't fit the typical patterns of bear-human encounters. Usually, when we have an incident like this, it's because someone surprised a bear or got between a mother and her cubs, Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled congregation. But this appears to have been different. The bear seems to have been attracted by food smells and then became aggressive when he felt trapped inside the building. Her assessment was that the attack was neither predatory nor defensive, but rather an assertion of dominance by a bear who found himself in an unfamiliar and stressful situation. This distinction was important for both understanding what had happened and determining what response might be appropriate. The question of what to do about the bear became a contentious issue within the community. Some residents argued that an animal that had attacked humans needed to be destroyed to prevent future incidents. Others contended that the bear had been acting according to his nature and that the real problem was human encroachment on wildlife habitat. Fish and Game's official position was that the bear would be monitored but not actively hunted unless there were additional incidents. Dr. Martinez's assessment was that Scarface had likely learned from the encounter and would be more likely to avoid human contact in the future rather than seeking it out. The media attention was immediate and intense. By afternoon, news vans from Anchorage television stations were arriving in Homer, and by evening the story was being picked up by national news outlets. The dramatic nature of the incident, a bear attacking a pastor during a church service, created exactly the kind of narrative that captured public imagination. The coverage was generally sympathetic to both the victims and the bear, though there were inevitable attempts to sensationalize the story. Several news outlets focused on the seeming irony of an attack occurring during a sermon about humanity's stewardship of nature, while others treated it as an example of the ongoing conflict between human development and wildlife habitat. Charles remained unconscious for the first 2 days following the attack, during which time the community organized itself around supporting both his family and the broader congregation. The practical aspects of his care were handled through a combination of insurance coverage and community fundraising, while the emotional support came through the informal networks that characterize small Alaskan communities. When Charles finally regained consciousness on the 3rd day, his first concern was for his congregation rather than his own injuries. Dr. Chen had to repeatedly reassure him that everyone else was safe before he would focus on his own recovery. His questions about the bear's fate revealed the same concern for all of God's creatures that had characterized his ministry. The physical recovery was lengthy and complicated. Charles's injuries included 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding that had required surgical repair, a concussion, and extensive soft tissue trauma. The doctors were optimistic about his long-term prognosis, but recovery would require months of physical therapy and careful monitoring. The psychological impact extended far beyond Charles himself. Elena Kowalski found herself struggling with anxiety attacks whenever she heard unexpected noises, particularly anything that resembled the sounds the bear had made. Emma was having nightmares and had developed a fear of going outside that concerned both her parents and the child psychologist they had consulted. Sarah Kowalski was dealing with her own trauma in a different way. The experience had given her a new appreciation for the fragility of life and had sparked an interest in emergency medicine that would eventually lead her to pursue a career as a paramedic. Michael was processing the event through research, spending hours learning about bear behavior and wildlife management. The Henderson family's reaction was mixed. Jim's initial sense that the experience had confirmed their decision to move to Alaska was gradually replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the responsibilities that came with living in wild country. Carol's fears about their safety were slowly giving way to an appreciation for the community support they had received. Amy decided to defer her return to college for another semester to help her family establish their new life. Margaret Thornton's guilt over her role in the incident was gradually being addressed through conversations with other community members and with Charles himself. When he was finally able to receive visitors, one of his first requests was to speak with Margaret privately to assure her that she bore no responsibility for what had happened. The church building itself became a symbol of the community's resilience. Rather than simply repairing the damage, the congregation decided to rebuild the entrance with stronger materials and better security measures, while also creating a small memorial garden to commemorate the experience. The memorial would honor not just the human victims, but also acknowledge the bear as a creature acting according to his nature. The insurance settlement covered most of the repair costs, but the community chose to upgrade the building's security features beyond what the insurance required. The new entrance included reinforced doors and windows, and a communication system that would allow contact with emergency services even from the remote location. Dr. Martinez's continuing study of the incident contributed to a better understanding of bear behavior in human-dominated landscapes. Her research suggested that incidents like this one were likely to become more common as human development continued to encroach on traditional bear habitat, particularly around areas like Homer, where residential development was expanding into previously wild areas. The broader community response included enhanced education about living safely in bear country, improved signage on trails and roads, and better coordination between various agencies responsible for wildlife management. The Homer Chamber of Commerce worked with Fish and Game to develop educational materials for tourists about appropriate behavior in areas where bears were present. 6 months after the attack, Charles was able to return to limited pastoral duties, though his physical recovery remained incomplete. His first sermon back in the rebuilt church addressed the theme of coexistence with the natural world, acknowledging both the beauty and the danger inherent in living close to wild places. The congregation had grown during his absence, partly due to media attention but mainly because of the community's response to the crisis. New families had been drawn to a church that had demonstrated such practical compassion, and several visitors had been impressed by the way the community had come together in the face of adversity. Scarface was spotted several more times in the months following the incident, but always at a distance from human habitation. Dr. Martinez's monitoring suggested that the bear had indeed learned from the encounter and was actively avoiding contact with humans. Trail cameras set up in the area showed him following his normal seasonal patterns, but giving human structures a wide berth. The incident eventually became part of the local folklore, told and retold with the kind of embellishment that characterizes community stories. But for those who had been present that September morning, it remained a vivid reminder of both the wildness that surrounded their small community and the strength that could be found in facing danger together. Charles's recovery continued slowly but steadily throughout the following year. The physical injuries healed more completely than the doctors had initially hoped, though he was left with some permanent limitations in mobility and strength. The psychological impact was more complex, involving not just the trauma of the attack itself, but also a deepened appreciation for the complexity of human relationships with the natural world. A year after the incident, the church held a special service of thanksgiving, not just for Charles's recovery, but for the broader lessons the community had learned about resilience, mutual support, and the responsibilities that come with living in one of the world's last wild places. The service was attended not just by the local congregation, but by visitors from across Alaska and beyond, who had been drawn by the story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with grace and courage. The rebuilt church now included a small library focused on wildlife conservation and wilderness safety, established with donations that had poured in from around the world in response to media coverage of the incident. The library served both the local community and the increasing number of visitors who came to Homer seeking a more authentic relationship with the natural world. Dr. Martinez's research into the incident was eventually published in the Journal of Wildlife Management and became a standard reference for understanding bear behavior in human-modified landscapes. Her work contributed to improved guidelines for construction in bear country and better protocols for handling similar incidents when they occurred. The long-term impact on the children who had witnessed the attack varied considerably. Emma eventually overcame her fear of the outdoors and developed a strong interest in wildlife photography, though she never lost her respect for the power of wild animals. Michael's research into bear behavior evolved into a broader interest in conservation biology that guided his college and career choices. Sarah Kowalski did indeed pursue emergency medicine, partly motivated by her admiration for Susan Nakamura's calm competence during the crisis. She eventually became a flight nurse on medical evacuation helicopters, bringing emergency medical care to remote communities across Alaska. Amy Henderson's decision to stay in Alaska led to her meeting her future husband, a wildlife biologist working on predator-prey relationships in the Kenai Peninsula. Their marriage several years later included Charles officiating at a ceremony held in the rebuilt church, with special attention paid to the themes of coexistence and mutual respect between humans and the natural world. The Henderson family's experience with the bear attack ultimately strengthened their commitment to their new life in Alaska. Jim's construction business prospered as more people sought to build homes designed with wildlife safety in mind, while Carol became involved in educational programs teaching newcomers about living safely in bear country. Margaret Thornton lived for several more years, during which time she became something of a local authority on bear safety and wilderness cooking. Her experience had taught her hard lessons about the unintended consequences of food storage and preparation in wild country, knowledge she shared willingly with anyone who would listen. She passed away peacefully at age 79, having never stopped baking her famous scones, but having learned to be much more careful about how and where she transported them. Old Pete Nakamura lived to be 95, often telling the story of the bear attack to younger generations as an example of how communities could respond to crisis with both courage and wisdom. His daughter Susan continued her nursing career, eventually becoming the head of emergency services at South Peninsula Hospital, where she used her experience from that September morning to help train other medical personnel in wilderness emergency response. The Volkov brothers expanded their boat repair business to include wildlife proofing services for buildings and vehicles, drawing on their practical experience with the church repairs. Their work contributed to a broader understanding of how human infrastructure could be designed to minimize dangerous encounters with wildlife. David Kowalski eventually ran for the Homer City Council, motivated partly by his experience during the bear incident. His platform focused on balanced approaches to development that took wildlife habitat seriously, and he served 2 terms before returning full-time to his fishing business. Elena continued teaching, but added wildlife safety education to her curriculum, using age-appropriate approaches to help children understand both the beauty and the danger of living in wild country. The bear attack at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church ultimately became a catalyst for broader changes in how the Homer community approached the challenge of coexisting with Alaska's wildlife. Building codes were updated to include wildlife deterrent features, educational programs were expanded, and emergency response protocols were improved based on lessons learned from the incident. Charles Boyd continued his ministry for another decade, his sermons enriched by the profound experience of surviving a violent encounter with one of God's most powerful creatures. His approach to the themes of creation, stewardship, and coexistence gained depth and authenticity that resonated with congregations far beyond his small Alaska church. He often spoke about the incident not as a failure of divine protection, but as a reminder of the complexity and power of the natural world that humans are called to respect and protect. The church itself became a pilgrimage site of sorts for people interested in wilderness spirituality and the challenges of living authentically in wild places. Visitors came not just to hear the story of the bear attack, but to experience a community that had demonstrated remarkable resilience and mutual support in the face of genuine danger. Dr. Martinez's research facility eventually received funding to establish a permanent monitoring station near Homer, focused on understanding how bear populations were adapting to increased human presence. The work contributed to wildlife management policies across Alaska and other areas where large predators and human communities intersected. Scarface himself lived for several more years, becoming something of a local celebrity through Dr. Martinez's research reports, though he maintained his learned avoidance of human contact. Trail cameras occasionally captured images of him during his seasonal migrations, showing a massive but healthy animal continuing to thrive in the wild landscapes around Kachemak Bay. His death, when it finally came, was from natural causes during hibernation, a peaceful end for an animal whose single dramatic encounter with humans had taught valuable lessons about coexistence, respect, and the wildness that still thrived in one of America's last frontiers. The story of that September morning became part of the broader narrative of Alaska itself, a place where the forces of civilization and wildness continued to intersect in ways that tested human courage, wisdom, and compassion. For those who lived through it, the bear attack was ultimately less about violence than about the deeper questions of how humans could live responsibly in a world that remained genuinely wild, genuinely dangerous, and genuinely beautiful. Years later, when visitors asked Charles about the meaning of his experience, he would often point to the rebuilt church, with its stronger doors and improved safety features, but also to its expanded mission of environmental education and wilderness spirituality. The attack had not driven the community away from the wild, but had taught them to engage with it more thoughtfully, more respectfully, and with a deeper appreciation for both its beauty and its power. The memorial garden behind the church grew over the years to include native plants that provided habitat for small wildlife, creating a space where visitors could contemplate the complex relationships between humans and the natural world. A simple plaque commemorated not just the human victims of the attack, but also acknowledged the bear as a creature following his own nature in a landscape increasingly shaped by human presence. In the end, the bear attack at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church became a story about more than survival. It became a story about learning, growing, and finding ways to live with dignity and respect in a world that remained beautifully and dangerously wild.